our Commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon. We're going to resume with portfolio questions, government business and constitutional relations. Our first question from Patrick Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what plans it has for a new constitutional convention.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll be inviting members to participate in a new constitutional convention which will aim to secure a consensus across Scottish society on Scotland's right to choose. I will consult with party leaders and the Parliament on the detail of this shortly.
Patrick Harvie.
It's often struck me as a little odd that those most hostile to independence quite often are those least likely to put forward a coherent alternative, another way of improving Scotland's constitutional status and governance instead of independence. So if they are willing to take this one last opportunity to try and put something positive onto the table, I'll welcome it. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this discussion, as well as dealing with the domestic constitutional questions, also should have room for discussion about how we can broaden and deepen Scotland's relationship with other countries, including across Europe, but not limited to that, the ability to forge those relationships in our own way, on our own terms?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do agree with the member, but I think the member makes a very important point. This is about openness to discussion. And particularly, and I've just said it in my opening answer, about a consensus on Scotland's right to choose. Now, there may well be different points of view on ultimate destination. Some may believe, as I hear from the benches to one side of me, that we've already reached the destination. But in those circumstances, I think openness to debate and discussion is the hallmark of a democracy. And I hope we might all the hallmark of a democracy is not shouting while somebody else is speaking. The hallmark of a democracy is being able to have that debate, and I look forward to it.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, President Officer. I look forward to engaging in these exchanges with the Cabinet Secretary in a constructive tone as we go forward. And in that vein, doesn't it every week go by demonstrate this idea of a constitutional convention? It's just a back of a fag packet notion dreamed up to placate the pro-independence fanatics on the SNP backbenches. And can he tell me how much the taxpayer is going to have to pay to fund this vanity exercise?
Cabinet Secretary.
Murdo Fraser to his new role, and also I look forward to a continuing redefinition of the English language. The word constructive has just been redefined. No doubt there will be more. The cost to Scotland of the Brexit process in which we are engaged, into which we have been dragged, for which we did not vote, and which will do, as we know, enormous harm, and we now see the migration process, which very sensible voices who are not mad nationalists by any manner of means are pointing the disastrous nature of them to Scotland. All those things make me believe that the expensive option is staying with the status quo.
Hilton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite the differing views and independence across this chamber, I'm sure that we will all agree it should be the people in Scotland to decide on their own future. In light of the cast iron mandate for another referendum from both the public and this Parliament, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that UK Government plans to block a second poll are simply unsustainable?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I notice a wider and wider range of people are pointing to the unsustainable nature of the UK Government's position. I thought the book event that the former Speaker, Mr Bercow, did last night was yet another indication that people looking at this say to themselves, Mr Bercow, of course, who was a Conservative, people looking at this would say to themselves, there is a basic problem in the attitude of the UK Government because it looks as if it does not have any interest either in democracy or the voice of the Scottish people. And I think that's a bad look in any democracy, and I hope that they will realise what a bad look it is and come back into the democratic mainstream.
And Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to have a discussion. I think that at this present time in Scotland, there is no majority demanding a second independence referendum. Now, I have made clear that the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future is absolute, and it's something that the Labour Party will support. The discussion for me is how best do we move forward, and in doing so, if we reach a position in the future where there is clearly a demand for a referendum, then that should not be denied. Well, is the Cabinet Secretary more open to having that wider discussion for those of us who reject the status quo, want to see far greater devolution take place, and is that on the table for discussion?
Yes, of course it is on the table for discussion. I respect Mr Rowley's position on this. I would want to debate it with him. I would want to say that I believe he's wrong in terms of the demand that exists. I would want to point to the way in which that demand is being expressed, including through elections. I would point to the fact that the clarity of the manifestos in December indicated that the election was about having Scotland's right to choose, and that was indicated very strongly. But of course, I respect Mr Rowley's position as a Democrat. He does not believe that independence is the solution at this time, and I'm glad for his openness in that continuity that might exist. That is precisely the type of thing that Scotland should be talking about. And I want to create the opportunity for Scotland to talk about that, not narrowly just amongst politicians, but more widely. So what I will bring forward is a set of proposals which starts that process. And if Mr Rowley and the Labour Party wants to and intends to contribute to that process, I would be delighted on the terms on which he has given.
Thank you. Question number 2, Jamie Greene.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government if all existing commitments from government ministers, serving or otherwise, to present evidence to parliamentary committees will go ahead.
Minister Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, Ministers will of course fulfil all commitments to give evidence to parliamentary committees. Requests to former ministers to give evidence are a matter for the individuals and the committee concerned.
Jamie Greene.
Can I thank the Minister for that update? The Minister will be aware that the Rural Economy Committee is midway through a very important cross-party inquiry into ferry procurement. The former Cabinet Secretary for Finance was due to give important evidence on the matter due to the specific involvement in some of the questions that the inquiry has raised, not least those of a financial nature. I appreciate the Government may choose to send whoever they deem fit. It is imperative that the committee is able to complete its inquiry by taking evidence from those with direct knowledge of events. So I can ask what reassurances the Minister will give the Chamber that the Government will work with committees to ensure that those that they do send to represent the Government will do so having direct knowledge and involvement in these matters, and therefore will speak from experience rather than hearsay.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, recognition of their accountability to the committees of this Parliament is demonstrated daily by Scottish Government ministers. As the Minister for Parliamentary Business, I have clear sight of the interaction between committees and ministers, and we consider their relationship generally to be very good. All of which is in sharp contrast, incidentally, to the relationship between our committees and ministers in the UK Government. The Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, for example, recently pulled out of an appearance before the European Committee at the 11th hour with no substantial explanation offered. And famously, David Davis assured MSPs he would give evidence at Holyrood as Brexit Secretary, but failed to do so in a 2-year tenure. Presiding Officer, whilst the UK Government seems to regard the committees of this Parliament with disdain, this Scottish Government recognises entirely its responsibilities in this regard. To be clear, any commitments given to attend committees by ministers will be honoured, but former ministers do not speak for the Government. Any commitments made by former ministers pass to their successors, and that is the situation, Presiding Officer.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Minister share my incredulity at the Tories' complete lack of self-awareness, such as their dog-like devotion to the London bosses? They have failed to notice the number of times UK ministers cancelled scheduled appearances at this Parliament's committee, often at short notice. Can he confirm that it is UK ministers who need to up their game, show this Parliament respect and attend our committees when invited?
Minister.
Well, absolutely. I think earlier we had a reinvention of the definition of constructive. I think the Tories can certainly reinvent the phrase self-awareness in this regard. And of course, it's not just the individuals that I highlighted, Alistair Jack and David Davis. There have been a raft of others. I think Esther McVeigh also qualifies in that category. So absolutely, it is high time that the UK Government and its ministers showed the committees of this Parliament the respect they deserve.
Question number 3, Rachael Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of potential customs checks on the Scotland-England border in light of comments by the First Minister during an address to the European Policy Centre.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government is committed to putting all the information on the proposition for an independent Scotland into the public domain ahead of an independence referendum. It is important to note that the Scottish Government does not wish to erect borders. It is the UK Government that wishes to erect borders by pursuing a hard Brexit. That is precisely what Boris Johnson is now doing.
Rachael Hamilton.
Constituents of mine in border towns such as Coldstream, Eyemouth and Jedburgh are deeply concerned by the First Minister's comments made in Brussels, where she failed to rule out a hard border in the event that Scotland became an independent country. Figures show that exports to the rest of the UK are worth £51.2 billion, 3 times more than exports worth £16.1 million to Scotland. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he will acknowledge the significant importance of the single market and ask why the Scottish Government would want to place a barrier between friends, families and neighbours in my constituency, crippling borders communities and inflicting customs checks on Scottish goods?
Cabinet Secretary.
The issue of self-awareness has just been redefined once again this afternoon. The member used the words single market. Apparently, Rachael Hamilton is in favour of the single market, which must be news to Boris Johnson. Let me be very clear about this. We do not wish, I am trying to make a point, Presiding Officer, we do not wish to erect any borders. The simplest way to have no borders would be and would continue to be the continued presence of all parts of these islands in the single market and the customs union. That is on offer. Anything that the UK government does to jeopardise that is the UK government's responsibility. If constituents of Rachael Hamilton's are worried, they should be expressing that worry to her, to the Conservatives and to Boris Johnson. Their friend in having no borders is me and the SNP.
Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, back in the real world, the UK Government has indicated that goods coming into the UK from the EU will face import controls from as early as January next year. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what engagement he has had with the UK Government over the preparations being made to prevent disruption to both businesses and consumers?
Yeah, this is a very, very broad supplementary to the question, so quite a short answer, Mr. Russell.
As ever, the UK Government has not told us what they intend in this case, because I don't think they have a clue.
Question number 4, Adam Tomkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met UK ministers to discuss post-Brexit international trade policy.
Minister Graham Day.
The Minister for International Trade and Investment, Ivan McKee, discussed a range of trade-related issues with Conor Burns, the UK Minister for International Trade, and counterparts from Wales and Northern Ireland on the 23rd of January.
Adam Tomkins.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Minister knows that I am robustly of the view that Brexit must be and has been devolved compatibly with our devolution settlement. Yet the Minister has unilaterally demanded a whole string of vetoes for his devolved administration on international trade, which is a reserved matter. How is that respecting the devolution settlement?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, sadly there's a world of difference between being in the room putting forward the needs of Scotland with a view to UK-wide negotiations and having these genuinely taken on board. And unlike Mr Tomkins, I speak from first-hand experience of this, having represented the Government on the Joint Ministerial Forum EN, which was designed to inform a joint negotiating position which catered for the needs of all parts of these islands. I seem to recall one particular session with UK ministers where they insisted to the devolved administrations that their concerns over continuing access to Erasmus were entirely misplaced. They'd be taken care of. Well, we all know what happened subsequently. The Tories voted down proposals at Westminster, committing them to securing future Erasmus involvement. Presiding Officer, whether it be on Erasmus, migration, trade, or a raft of other important matters, there's one certainty. Either Scottish ministers fight Scotland's corner, or Scotland risks being turned over by the Tories. We'll leave Mr Tomkins to strategise a way. Our team of ministers will continue to stand up for Scotland's interest in Brexit negotiations, particularly on trade.
Question number 5, Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what engagement it has had with the UK Government in providing young people with clarity regarding whether they will continue to have access to the Erasmus Plus programme following Brexit.
I can welcome to our new portfolio, Minister Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has been engaging extensively with the UK Government throughout the pre- and post-EU exit period, both at ministerial and official level. The Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, Richard Lockhead, has been in regular contact to discuss Erasmus Plus with the UK Government Universities Ministers, which has included participating in all UK nations quadrilateral meetings. Scottish Government officials are engaging with the Department for Education and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on Erasmus Plus potential domestic alternatives, while reiterating the Scottish Government's position that full association to Erasmus Plus is in the best interest for both Scotland and the whole of the UK. However, despite frequent requests by the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, all at the Joint Ministerial Committee meeting on EU negotiations, UK Government departments have refused to share final drafts of crucial value for money assessments with Scottish Government officials. These assessments are being used by the Treasury to make decisions that will directly impact on future participation. The Scottish Government has raised this directly with HM Treasury and will continue to do so alongside the other devolved administrations.
Sandra White.
Thank the Minister and congratulate and welcome to her new post for the very full reply, which is obviously very, very concerning, particularly in my constituency of Glasgow Kelvin, where we have thousands of students who have actually benefited from Erasmus, and it's very worrying for the current students and for future students going there as well, generations really to come. Now, you mentioned the fact that there's nothing forthcoming from the UK Parliament. Can I ask the Minister and the Scottish Government if they would push forward with talks, or if they've had talks with other European countries in regards, perhaps open a dialogue with our European friends to discuss how we can safeguard this very, very important Erasmus for students?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say to Sandra White that having studied and lived in her constituency, I'm only too aware from personal experience of the huge benefit the Erasmus Plus programme brings to Glasgow Kelvin. The Scottish Government is absolutely committed to ensuring that we do everything in our gift to maintain the Erasmus Plus scheme. As part of our preparations for EU exit, we are therefore progressing work in relation to a number of different scenarios. Our preferred outcome is, of course, that the whole of the UK remains associated to Erasmus+. However, in the event that the UK Government decides to abandon the programme, we are exploring the option of Scotland's unilateral association. Work in this area is ongoing and it features a number of interconnected elements, including considerations on how to best engage with our European partners concerning this issue. It is also worth noting that the European Commission has proposed to double the funding of Erasmus for the next cycle to €30 billion. That's funding that Scotland will miss out on, but it's also knowledge transfer, it's friendships, it's relationships which the next generation will miss too. Presiding Officer, I'm sure I do not need to remind members that this is not what our constituents voted for in June 2016.
Question 6, John Finney.
To ask the Scottish Government what communication it's had with the UK Government and how it will protect Scotland's crofters in upcoming trade deal talks with the EU.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we've received no communication from the UK Government on the protection of crofting interests in upcoming trade deal discussions. The Scottish Government is committed to doing all it can to support crofting for the benefit of present and future generations. As a former crofting minister and as an MSP with crofting constituency interests, I know that crofting continues to form an integral part and contributes to the sustainability of our rural and remote areas. Crofting delivers real benefits, sustaining agricultural activity, supporting the rural economy, enhancing wildlife and the natural environment, and retaining young people in our remote, rural and island communities. It is worth standing up for, and we will stand up for it.
John Finney.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply? And the Cabinet Secretary knows that Brexit's a disaster for the Highlands and Islands. He also knows of the importance of rearing sheep to crofters and of the potential tariffs of 40 to 50% being imposed on lamb. Cabinet Secretary, a survey in 2017 by the Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers talked about the significant dependence of migrant labour. 52% of the unskilled workforce, 44% of the skilled workforce and 16% of the supervisory and management staff. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise what consultation the UK Government has had with the Scottish Government about the horrendous consequences of their hard Brexit strategy, coupled with their newly announced immigration policy, and what implications that will have for meat production in the Highlands and Islands, one of the many sectors that will be negatively impacted by the ill-judged actions of a far-right UK Tory government?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member is absolutely correct in terms of lamb and sheep production. I know from my own constituents and from my own engagement, for example, with the National Farmers Union of Scotland within Argyll, that if there were to be the tariffs talked about, that would be the end of the lamb trade for my constituents. I also know that that is the case in Wales, where there has been discussion at the JMC about lamb and the impact on Scottish and Welsh economies. The member can be reassured that we will continue to pursue these issues, but it does show very clearly that the idea that there is some form of Brexit, some one-size-fits-all form of Brexit, which in the words of not just the Prime Minister, but even Douglas Ross, who was a member of this chamber and I understand is now a Scottish minister, that in some size these will always benefit Scotland, is untrue.
Question number 7, Sarah Boyle.
Scottish Government what steps it is taking to ensure that EU powers that related to devolved matters are devolved to the Scottish Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary.
Sarah Boyack, Presiding Officer, is right to be concerned about this matter. It's not the first occasion which she's asked about it. There is a continuing risk that the UK Government uses Brexit to claw powers back from this Parliament. We've been clear that on EU withdrawal, the EU powers over agriculture, fisheries, the environment and elsewhere should be exercised by this Parliament in line with the devolution settlement. We have tried to work with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to negotiate and agree UK-wide frameworks where that is in our interests. But these must be agreed and not imposed. We'll continue to resist any and all attempts to constrain this Parliament. I'm glad that parties across this chamber have in the past supported this position, and I do hope that will continue.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response? In terms of the environment, in relation to food standards and procurement, for example, will the Scottish Government continue to use EU standards as a benchmark to drive continuous improvement?
Cabinet Secretary.
I made it clear in my evidence to the Culture and European Committee this morning that we intend to take steps to ensure that we can keep pace with European regulation and European standards. Moreover, we believe that that is our absolute right as a devolved administration in the areas of devolved competence to choose how we benchmark ourselves and how we take ourselves forward. We will bring forward, as I indicated previously, a continuity bill that allows us to do so, and we will also make sure that in other areas we are insisting upon the highest standards. I should point out, Presiding Officer, this isn't arcane or technical. This is about ensuring that the common interests, common beliefs, common opportunities and the common views that we have across Europe are sustained. We want to associate ourselves with these standards, not because we want to associate ourselves with Europe, but because they're the right things for Scotland, and we intend to do so.
Thank you very much, and that concludes portfolio questions. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 20923 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for stage 3 of the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20923 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. So our next item for consideration is Stage 3 proceedings for the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. So in dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list and the grouping of amendments. Just to remind members, I'm sure most will know by now, the division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. There will be a 30-second vote at that stage. Thereafter, the first vote will have a 1-minute vote after each group. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as soon as possible after I call the group. So members should now turn to the grouping of amendments. The marshalled list, sorry. I call Group 1, voting in Scottish elections by qualifying foreign nationals. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and to speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to say on the outset that I'm very pleased that we've now got to stage 3 of this bill, which is a brief bill, but is a significant and important bill in my view. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to take it through this afternoon. This will also be the first bill that this Parliament has considered, which requires a supermajority. So it is also another moment in Scottish parliamentary history. And I also want to just point out, and I hope we can have a very constructive debate, that there aren't any amendments here. Well, there's 2 in the name of Liam MacArthur, which we'll come to later. But there aren't any substantive amendments in here on issues in the bill which were not discussed in stage 2. So we have, in actual fact, a rerun. Now, I know there's some changes, and I know members will refer to those changes, but we have rehearsed these at some length, and I'm sure we will bear that in mind. I am pleased, Presiding Officer, that the bill's provisions extend voting rights to foreign national residents in Scotland, and they have been, and it's important to stress at the beginning, widely welcomed, both by the Standards Committee and the respondents to the Government's consultation on electoral reform. This is not a minor matter. This is a major step forward. Amendments 1 to 9 alter the bill's description of the voting rights of EU nationals, bringing them into line with other foreign nationals. This is a consequence of Brexit having occurred following the bill's introduction. The requirements of EU law on voting in municipal elections by EU nationals are no longer applicable. These amendments recognise that following Brexit, some EU nationals living here will have leave restrictions that only allow them to remain for a certain period of time. It would not be logical for a person who should not legally be in the country to have voting rights. And so the amendments seek to put EU nationals on the same basis as those from all other countries. As a result, only those foreign nationals living here with leave to remain will be able to vote in our elections, whatever their country of origin. That is a substantial step forward. It should not be diminished. It is a big step forward. It is worth bearing in mind here that the Republic of Ireland, of course, remains a special case, and their citizens do not require leave to remain. Now, the question of leave to remain brings me to Mark Ruskell's amendments 21 to 23. And it might be helpful for me to remind members that this bill does seek to extend voting rights to those with refugee leave. It has sought to do so from the outset, and that is the step that few other countries have taken. And I am proud of the fact that that is the bill we are considering today. But the Standards Committee considered whether we should go further and also enfranchise asylum seekers. It had evidence about arrangements in Ireland where uniquely asylum seekers can vote and stand in local but not national elections. Vitally, the committee also heard about the practical concerns raised by electoral registration officers on how to accurately maintain records of asylum seekers with voting rights. And the committee ultimately decided not to support Mr Ruskell's proposals at stage 2. Reluctantly, because I have the greatest sympathy for the proposals, but there are huge practical issues which simply cannot be wished away. Mr Ruskell's Amendment 21 seeks to assist electoral registration officers in registering foreign nationals. That might be supported if these other amendments were accepted. But I'm not convinced that all the difficulties identified by the returning officers in enfranchising asylum seekers have been addressed. And although Amendment 21 could in theory be used to assist with other issues involving foreign nationals, it would only really be practical use in relation to asylum seekers. Now, Mr Ruskell's lead amendment, number 23, seeks to simplify matters. It provides that voting rights will only be conferred until the point at which the asylum seeker's application was determined. Now, I would interpret this as ruling out any period in which an appeal was underway. This therefore seeks to respond to concerns by how electoral registration officers will know when an asylum seeker whose case has been refused should be removed from the register. I fear the overall result would in fact not simplify but complicate an already complex situation. An example might be an asylum seeker might remain at the property for some time after the initial determination of the case. So electoral registration officers have to identify, and this is not their job, a person as an asylum seeker, but then remove them if the initial decision went against them, and then re-register the person if they subsequently gained refugee status following an appeal. It's not impossible, but at a time when we're asking returning officers to make other major changes, the integrity of the poll and the register becomes an issue. We're already asking electoral registration officers to administer prisoner voting in addition of 55 to 60,000 foreign nationals. The enfranchisement of asylum seekers with a pending asylum claim would be a further onerous burden for electoral registration officers and their staff. The amendment would effectively require them to become experts or arbiters in immigration law. That's not something we can reasonably impose on those who are responsible for ensuring the electoral register is accurate and up to date. The Standards Committee specifically called for the government to consider how to make the electoral register as complete and accurate as possible. That is a quote. And we must therefore listen, no matter how reluctantly, when it's suggested that enfranchising asylum seekers will in fact damage the overall accuracy of the register and risk eroding public trust in the electoral process. I share Mr Ruskell's aspiration to have as wide a franchise as possible. We are bringing very significant changes to that franchise in this bill. This bill does represent a major step forward in welcoming many to our franchise. But as I said at stage 2, Mr Ruskell's further amendments risk making the best the enemy of the good, and therefore reluctantly I cannot endorse them.
And I call Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 21 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Yesterday in this Parliament, I hosted an event with an absolutely wonderful group of asylum seekers who are part of our communities. And can I thank members from across the Chamber for coming along to that event and engaging with these people. And I think what struck me personally more than anything was that the right to vote is seen by asylum seekers as a fundamental human right. For many, this is seen as being even as important as the right to work. It's an acknowledgement of their very existence. It's an acknowledgement that they have a voice and that they're valued. And they see the right to vote as a powerful invitation to integrate with the community as well. It's a recognition that they're not alien, they're not others. They're part of us, they're part of our communities. And I would ask the question, how many of our fellow citizens value their right to vote in the same way? How many of us actually in this chamber feel the same way about our right to vote? So we have to find a way through here. And for so many asylum seekers, they're stuck in limbo, often for years in the system, while they continue to have a legal right to live in this country throughout the consideration of their asylum application. They're not illegally present in the UK, but can often be here for years and years while claims are being considered. Members of our communities, but isolated, unheard, and often unintegrated. Now, back in 2018, Mr Fitzpatrick, when he was Minister, said that the franchise, and I quote, should include those who were welcomed here as refugees and people going through the process of seeking asylum. Now, recognising the concerns raised at stage 2, I have engaged with electoral registration officers to understand the practical paperwork challenges of registering asylum seekers, and I've sought to address them. And we've had a number of engagements, and the most recent was I received a letter from the Scottish Assessors Association who say that the issues you raised with regard to asylum seekers are a matter of policy, and therefore the Assessors Association does not offer a view on this matter. So the guidance from EROs there is that this is a matter for government to consider, for government to find a way through here as a matter of policy, not the electoral registration officers. Yes, okay.
Adam Tomkins.
Very grateful to the member for giving way. I mean, of course, the assessments are correct. It is a matter of policy, but it is a policy which will have a whole series of significant bureaucratic and administrative challenges that need to be addressed before, in my judgment, this Parliament can give effect to the policy intention that Mr Ruskell is seeking to support. Now, I don't often agree with Mike Russell, but the Cabinet Secretary gave a whole series of quite detailed observations as to the administrative challenges that the members' amendments would pose for electoral administrators. And we need to see what his response is to those details before we can support his amendments.
Mark Ruskell.
Okay, well, I appreciate that intervention. I mean, I'm coming to those points, but what I would say is that the registration issues that are faced with registering asylum seekers are not materially different to the registration of many other people that this bill seeks to enfranchise. There are very similar issues, and I'll come on to those if I'm given the time a little bit later on. People seeking asylum in Scotland will be able to meet the main tests for voter eligibility. They're present in Scotland. They have a recorded Home Office address. They are lawfully resident in the country by the nature of having an outstanding asylum claim. That status already enables them to legally access services to health and education. There are precedents here in the way that asylum seekers access services in our society. Now, what these amendments do is they grant that franchise extension for asylum seekers, but they also allow for guidance to be issued so that forms of identification issued by the Home Office can be used to prove identity. It ticks that box. Asylum seekers move their residency no more than anyone else does, and probably less than students or, for example, those in private lettered accommodation. So the integrity of the register is no more of an issue with this group than it is for anyone else. Once an asylum claim is rejected, then within time they are removed from their registered dispersal accommodation. There's no need for EROs to be determining the legal immigration status of an individual for which documentation and their very existence in a residence in Scotland is proof of eligibility. The bill already guarantees that the temporariness of someone's leave to remain in Scotland should not affect their right to vote in Scottish elections. These amendments are merely extending the rights to asylum seekers that the bill already gives to citizens from outside the European Economic Area who may have similar immigration conditions. Presiding Officer, everyone who makes Scotland their home for however long should have a voice in our democracy, equally valued, regardless of where they're born, integrated as new Scots from day one, welcomed and respected. And that's why I move these amendments in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Ruskell. I call Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I'll turn first to the Cabinet Secretary's Amendments 1 to 9. These have the effect of recognising and bringing into line European nationals with other foreign national voters in recognition of the UK's departure from the European Union and the potential for different immigration positions that now arises. These are sensible recognition of the current situation, and we will not oppose them. The further three amendments in the group 21, 22 and 23 from Mark Ruskell deal with voting by people with certain limited residence. I'm aware of the campaigning he has done, particularly around those applying for refugee status. These arguments were largely covered by the committee at stage 2, and a number of the same issues still apply, and the member hasn't addressed those, I think, suitably for us, certainly today, so we will not be supporting these amendments.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by James Kelly.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by echoing the Cabinet Secretary's comments about the importance of this bill and what, in a sense, it says about the country we wish to be in terms of being open, outward-looking and indeed welcoming. And I can certainly confirm that Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting all of the amendments from the Government in this group. Notwithstanding the concerns that have been raised by the Cabinet Secretary and indeed by the Conservative members, I thank Mark Ruskell for bringing forward his amendment, which would allow asylum seekers with live applications and their dependents to vote. I think it's critical that asylum seekers are given a warm welcome from day one and that they are helped to live with dignity. That means sorting out the horrendous conditions that they can be housed in. It means letting them work instead of deliberately forcing them into destitution. It means ensuring trauma services are available without delay. Applications can get stuck in the Home Office for years, even when it's fairly cut and dry, and it's obvious that people are genuinely seeking refuge in our country. As my colleague Beatrice Wishart put it, and she's been involved in many of these cases affecting constituents in the Northern Isles over the years, languishing in the dark recesses of that department causes real detriment and disruption to those trying to rebuild their lives. While they wait, people can work and pay tax for a decade. Their children can be on the verge of completing their schooling. They are part of our communities, and our voting system should reflect that. It should be compassionate and outward-looking, rather than say to people fleeing war and horrors that we don't believe them. And on that basis, it will be supporting Mark Ruskell's amendment.
Thank you. And James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour will support all the amendments in this group. In terms of the Cabinet Secretary's amendments 1 to 9, these are essentially technical amendments which improve the legal understanding and policy objectives of the bill. The main issue of contention here is clearly Mark Ruskell's amendments 21, 22 and 23. The overall policy objective of the bill to extend the franchise to foreign nationals residing in Scotland and prisoner voting, to which we will come later, is one which we support. I think I've listened very carefully to the contributions. I think Mark Ruskell and Liam MacArthur make very good points in terms of asylum seekers, should be welcomed into the country, and as part of that should be an extension to the right to vote where there are live pending asylum seeker cases. I think the issue of debate seems to be around the Cabinet Secretary seems sympathetic to that argument, but he opposes the amendments on the basis of practicality, and the issue seems to be around data collection and updating of the appropriate register and IT systems. I wouldn't have thought that would have been beyond us in 2020 to ensure that we had appropriate technology in place to make sure that the register was up to date. I noted what Mark Ruskell had said in reflecting on the stage 2 evidence, and I'm therefore convinced by Mark Ruskell's arguments, and Scottish Labour will support these amendments when we come to vote on them shortly.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. And can I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I stress at the beginning that I have been strongly in favour of this bill and what it seeks out to do from the beginning, and I remain strongly in favour of this bill, and it is a significant step forward, if not a massive step forward, in terms of how we change the franchise. But equally, as a minister, I cannot tell this chamber that you can wish away problems if they exist within a system, particularly when some of the things in this bill lay issues in front of returning officers which will take time and effort to resolve. And if the advice is that to add further things to this will create additional difficulties which are very difficult to solve, and when we come on in a later section to look at issues of candidacy, we'll discover that in actual fact there are some issues that are out of this Parliament's scope. Do I like that? Of course not. I don't want anything that's out of this Parliament's scope. But the reality of the situation is I cannot recommend supporting things that are going to create these difficulties and affect the register. And I go back to the Standards Committee view, it is an initial report. We must consider, the government must consider how to make the electoral register as complete, as accurate as possible. We will not do that if we pass Mr Ruskell's amendments. I am not against asylum seekers. And I know nobody has said that this government is, but the sort of implication that because we can't support this, we don't support asylum seekers is utterly untrue. But yes, fine.
Mark Ruskell.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I really am trying to drill down here as to what the concern is, and particularly the efforts to try and resolve this concern between stage 2 and stage 3. I'm trying to understand why there's a difference between asylum seekers that may leave a property and somebody who's in a private rented property who may move from time to time, or a student who may be there for a short period of time then move. Each of those groups affect the integrity of the electoral register. We're not sitting here today saying, oh, we should take the vote away from students or people in private accommodation because they might move every 6 months.
The basic question is that eligibility does not change. The eligibility of an asylum seeker may well change, and there'll be a process to which they go. I don't like that. I would like to redraw the entire migration and asylum system, and that this Parliament should have the right to do so. But under the present system, that does change. And therefore, there is an enormous difference. And Mr. Ruskell also mentioned documentary proof. We're therefore also asking returning officers to seek additional documentary proof from a range of individuals who they have to identify first of all. This is simply, at this stage, not practical. Would it be practical in the future? Mr. Kelly is absolutely right. No problem is insuperable. But when we're making major changes, which are already the returning officers saying they have major work to do, they are saying we can't do any more and there are special difficulties here. And I don't believe it's a responsible position to just ignore that. So reluctantly, and I say it yet again, reluctantly, I cannot accept Mr. Ruskell's amendments. I wish I could. And if there had been perhaps more time to do this and the returning officer said entered into further discussion, maybe it could have been done. But we've been through 2 stages of this bill. We're at the final stage now. In the view of those who are most deeply involved, it cannot be done. And it cannot be done without affecting the integrity of the register. And that, as the Minister responsible for that and for election in this Parliament, I cannot recommend to this Chamber. I would ask members to support the amendments I have put down, and I'm glad there's a welcome for them. I would ask them to take a responsible position on this with a view that this is not something that we are happy about, but it is something that is a fact.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendments 2 to 8, all previously debated? Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the amendments on block?
Moved on block.
Thank you very much. Does any member object if I put the question 2 to 8 on block? No, that's good. So the question is that Amendments 2 to 8 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. Can I call Amendment 21 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move.
Yeah, moved.
That is moved. Yeah. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. This is the first division of the afternoon, so I'll summon members to the Chamber and I'll suspend Parliament for 5 minutes while we do so. Parliament is suspended for 5 minutes. Thank you, colleagues. Parliament is resumed and I call Amendment 21. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to and members may cast their votes now. This is a 30-second division. The result of the vote on Amendment 21 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 32, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call Amendment 9, Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 22, Mark Ruskell to move or not move. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. This will be a 30-second vote. The result of the vote on amendment number 22 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 32, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 23, Mark Ruskell, to move or not move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on amendment 23. The result of the vote on Amendment 23 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 32, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We turn now to Group 2, eligibility for nomination, election and holding office in Scottish elections. Can I call Amendment 10 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with amendments as shown, and the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 10 and speak to all the amendments in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is a connection between Group 1 and Group 2 in terms of eligibility and nomination and holding office, and I'll come to that in just a moment. But I need to point out this is a complex group of amendments containing a number of different propositions in relation to candidacy rights, and I'll go through them. It might assist members if I explain that the bill as introduced sought to only extend candidacy rights to those foreign nationals with indefinite leave to remain in the UK. Now, I appreciate that position might have appeared somewhat harsh in respect of individuals who have lived here for many years on the basis of a succession of 2- or 3-year leave periods which have been regularly renewed. I would, and I repeat this, having just said it in the previous session, like to see full control over immigration in Scotland rest with this Parliament. But the fact remains that it is presently, hopefully not forever, a reserved matter. And we can't wish that fact away, nor can we, and this is important, legislate as if it isn't true. And that is a really important issue. I'd like to, but you can't. Following discussions on candidacy at stage 2, I wrote to the Home Secretary to explore whether we could come to an agreement where employment restrictions could be waived for those seeking to stand or be elected to serve as councillors or MSPs. The question has, I have to say, without any surprise, thus far gone unanswered. As things stand, allowing persons to stand for election who have no guarantee of being allowed to remain in the UK for the duration of their term of office, or even to polling day itself, presents an unacceptable degree of risk. But I did highlight a number of issues at stage 2 where I considered we could go further within the current immigration framework. I explained in the debate on the previous group that the advent of Brexit required an adjustment to the way in which the bill described the voting rights of EU nationals. The same position applies in relation to their candidacy rights. As a result, Amendments 10, 11, 16 and 17 seek to ensure that any EU national whose leave to remain in the UK has expired cannot stand for election in the Scottish Parliament and local government elections. The committee highlighted the need to take action here in its Stage 1 report. These amendments recognise that following Brexit, some EU nationals living here will have leave restrictions that only allow them to remain for a certain period of time. It would not be logical for a person whose right to legally be in the country have expired to continue to have candidacy rights. As a result, the amendments seek to put EU nationals on the same basis as all others. Amendments 12, 13, 14, 15, 18, 19 and 20 seek to ensure that European Economic Area nationals with pre-settled status can stand in Scottish Parliament and local government elections and then hold office. The bill currently sets out candidacy rights for those with indefinite leave to remain, which will include EEA nationals with settled status, but not for any person with time-limited leave. Persons are granted pre-settled status when they are not able to evidence 5 years' residence in the UK at the point of application. In many cases, and even the UK government says this, the individual will progress to settled status in due course. These amendments seek to provide candidacy rights during this pre-settled stage and are a logical extension of the policy of maintaining the rights of EU citizens following Brexit. Amendment 15 makes the principal change in respect to the Scottish Parliament elections, and Amendment 20 is the principal amendment in terms of local government elections. Now, Mr Ruskell has made two separate sets of proposals in relation to candidacy rights for those foreign nationals not already covered by the bill. One set of proposals is set out in Amendments 15A, 15B, 15C, 20A, 20B and 20C. These amendments envisage allowing the Scottish ministers to grant candidacy rights in Scottish Parliament and local government elections by regulation to certain categories of foreign nationals who have limited leave to remain. The other proposal, as set out in Amendments 24 to 29, seeks to grant candidacy rights to all foreign nationals with limited leave to remain, but to allow Scottish ministers to set out exceptions by regulations. And that is a logical two sets of proposals. They are essentially an inclusive and exclusive set. Now, the law here is complex, and I appreciate why Mr Ruskell has sought to present alternate options. However, the second proposal would be out with the legislative competence of the Parliament. And I return to what I said earlier. This would have a direct bearing on a reserved issue, the employment capacity of foreign nationals. Now, I appreciate the amendments seek to grant a power to exclude certain categories of persons in order to avoid encroaching upon that reservations, but that's not how the law works. That would come too late. The bill would have already trespassed into the reserved issues of employment capacity before we could exercise the power. And I therefore have to invite Mr Ruskell not to press Amendments 24 to 29 because they would place the bill out of scope and into a reserved area. Mr Ruskell's other proposal, that set out in Amendments 15A to 15C and 28 to 20C, seeks instead to allow ministers to extend candidacy rights by regulations to certain additional categories of foreign nationals with limited leave. Now, as I've said before, I remain sympathetic to the intention of these amendments, and I have reflected upon them. But I've come to the conclusion I cannot see a realistic circumstance in which you could actually use the powers. This is because we can only allow those not subject to a work or study restriction to stand, and we are unable to readily describe all of those persons. As Mr Ruskell knows, identifying every category of person with leave restrictions in regulations would be no easy task. It would also be a task like painting the Forth Bridge. It would never be done. The list would have to be continually updated as the Home Office adjusted immigration categories or changed the law. Indeed, the Home Office has announced details of a new system this very week. Now, accept that some categories with limited leave and no employment restrictions would be easier to identify than others. But acting for them alone would raise serious considerations of fairness and equity. Suppose we allowed refugees to stand as candidates. Somebody in a much less clearly defined group, the spouse of a person here for a specific job, might well be able to raise a challenge that they were being treated unfairly. I again recognise that the intention from Mr Ruskell is good, but these amendments, once again, are not practical propositions, and one set of them are exceedingly dangerous in terms of the competence of this bill. To adopt them would risk confusion. I cannot see the powers being stowed ever being used, whilst the immigration system, which is an area of near constant flux, remains reserved to Westminster. I know I would have Mr Ruskell's support were we to bring the immigration system home, and I want to do that. But we can't legislate as if migration was already completely devolved, however much we would like that to be the case. I therefore reluctantly but very firmly invite members not to support Amendments 15A, 15B, 15C, 20A, 20B, 20C and the alternatives that have been put forward.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I call Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 24 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for those points? And having reflected on his views in relation to Amendments 20 to 29, I will not be now moving those amendments. However, I do want to focus my comments on the group, starting with 15A. Can I perhaps first start by saying that I welcome the amendments tabled by the other amendments tabled by the Cabinet Secretary in this group to extend candidacy rights to one group who have a limited leave to remain, namely EU citizens with pre-settled status. I've engaged with many of these citizens within my own region, with Mr McPherson here, with Mr Crawford as well at public meetings. They're a valued part of our community. They absolutely need to have candidacy rights as well. So I welcome the extension of candidacy rights to that group. However, the amendments that are put forward by the government do not extend to other people from outside of the EU who are similarly here, on a similar basis, with an equally limited leave to remain. And I would just say to the Chamber, why should it be that an EU national is entitled to stand as a candidate from day one of their arrival in Scotland, whereas a refugee from Iran would have to live in Scotland for 5 years and successfully apply for an indefinite leave to remain before they had the right to stand? How are those two groups different? What is the difference between these people? Because they are still resident in our communities. Why is one more fit to stand for public office rather than the other? Now, I recognise what the Cabinet Secretary says about the immigration system being in constant flux. If only this immigration system was controlled by this chamber. He knows my views on that. But that's not an excuse for us working up to the very limit of the powers of devolution to give these people who are part of our communities the very utmost rights to participate within our democracy. Now, I recognise that there are limits here. I recognise that extending a candidacy right to asylum seekers would be very difficult given restrictions on their ability to take up paid employment. But for others who are allowed to work, then again, full participation in democracy and a matching of the franchise with candidacy rights should be the norm. I appreciate what the Cabinet Secretary says about the flux within the immigration system, how this would require regulations to come forward. But surely we should take whatever action that we can to enfranchise these people and to give them candidacy rights within our communities.
Thank you, Mr Russell. Can I call Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Lee MacArthur?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This group of amendments deals particularly with candidacy and elections. The Government has set out their amendments 10 and 11, which will make provision for a European national whose leave to remain has expired to lose the right to stand in elections to the Scottish Parliament. Similar arguments apply to amendments 1 to 9 in the previous group, and I consider this amendment to do little more than recognise the position following the UK's departure from the EU. Therefore, these are reasonable and we will not oppose them. By extension, we will not oppose amendments 16 and 17 that address the same issue in relation to local government elections. Amendments 12 to 15 and 18 to 20 recognise that the EU nationals with pre-settled status will not lose the right to stand and hold office in Scottish Parliament and Council elections. Those with pre-settled status will be resident EU nationals who have come to the UK and previously enjoyed the rights, firstly, to vote and secondly, to stand in elections to the Scottish Parliament and to local authorities. We do not seek to withdraw these existing rights that EU citizens resident here have enjoyed. But on this side of the chamber, we are also clear that voting rights for those with pre-settled and settled status should be replicated for British nationals who are resident in the rest of the EU.
Thank you. Lee MacArthur to be followed by James Kelly.
Thanks very much. Can I start by warmly welcoming my friend and former Justice Committee colleague, Jenny O'Gilruth, to the front bench and confirm that I will be supporting her colleagues' amendments, the Cabinet Secretary's amendments in this group. And for the reasons that the Cabinet Secretary has set out, but the reasons I set out in earlier voting in favour of asylum seekers having the vote, I've got a great deal of sympathy for Mike Ruskell's amendments in this group, but there are complications and unresolved issues that make it difficult to support Mr Ruskell on this occasion. Voters deserve clarity when people stand. The clarity that the person they are voting for has the right to work and take up the position to which they're elected. Clarity that they will be able to serve the 5-year term because the system shouldn't invite by-elections, and clarity that the person they are voting for can be paid the same as everyone else. And I'm not comfortable entrenching existing inequalities by asking people who already have disadvantaged backgrounds to somehow work for free. My colleague Christine Jardine has tried to change the law to give asylum seekers the right to work after 3 months, which would be a vast improvement and make a real difference. But that is still not the case. There is also a significant danger that this Parliament would be acting out with its competence, and I expect the Advocate General for Scotland would be taking a close look at these amendments were they to be incorporated in this bill. There are many parts of this bill that are very welcome and which it is important are in place ahead of the elections next year. I'm reluctant to provoke another dispute like that which we saw over the continuity bill, because it is not clear to me whether the changes Mr Ruskell is proposing would withstand a court challenge, and on that basis we cannot support the amendments from Mr Ruskell in this grouping.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. I call James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour will support the amendments brought forward by Mr Russell in relation to this group. We believe that they bring necessary legal clarity around candidacy rights. I note Mark Ruskell's comments that he won't press amendments 24, 25, 27 and 28. In relation to 15A, B and C and 20A, B and C, I listened carefully to the arguments from both Mark Ruskell and Mike Russell, and I'm persuaded by the Cabinet Secretary's arguments, particularly the issue around certainty for candidates. I think, as Liam MacArthur said, if voters are going to the poll, they have a right to expect that the person that they are elected will be able to fulfil that duty and be able to fulfil it for the full term. In addition to that, I think the Cabinet Secretary makes valid points. I'm just finishing. Makes valid points around legal competence, and we don't want to get into a position where there are potential court challenges to this crucial piece of legislation.
And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd make 3 very brief points. First of all, Mr Ruskell asked asked me why I thought that an Iranian citizen was more fit to stand for election than a European citizen. I do not think that is the case. But again, as in the first section, there are 2 different categories of individual here, and you cannot exactly equate them in terms of this bill and what the candidacy rights would be. Secondly, Mr Ruskell wants me to work up to the limits of the powers of this Parliament. I am very happy to work beyond the limits of the powers of this Parliament, but the basic point arises that if you try and pretend something is not the case, you can't will it to be the case by passing legislation which could be challenged. And that is the third point. And I think Mr MacArthur and Mr Kelly have made a really important point. If this bill was to have within it items which could be challenged by the Advocate General, then we would face a serious delay in putting this bill into practice, because it will have, we hope, royal assent and then move forward. That would jeopardise implementing this bill for the 2021 elections. We do not wish to do that. The work is being done to put this into place. So I do think in these circumstances, whilst again I understand the argument, I think it is best that we move forward in a way that ensures that this bill can become law, should the Chamber support it later today, that it is a supermajority bill, this bill becomes law and then begins to be implemented. So I would urge members, and I'm glad members are going to support my amendments. Reluctantly, again, I would urge them to reject the amendments from Mark Ruskell.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendments 11, 12, 13 and 14 and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move on block?
Moved on block.
Thank you very much. Does any member object if we vote on block to Amendments 11 to 14? No. That's good. So the question is that Amendments 11 to 14 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 24, Mark Ruskell, to move or not move? That is moved. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division on Amendment 24. This will be a 1-minute division. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 24 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 27, no 91. Yes, no 92. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 25 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to division on amendment 25. Members, we vote now. This is a 30-second vote. The result of the vote on amendment number 25 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 26, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 15 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated? Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moved.
That is moved. And can I call amendment 15A in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. So the question is that amendment 15A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division on amendment 15A. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 15A in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 6, no 113. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 15B, Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. Can I call amendment 15C, Mark Ruskell to move or not move? That's not moved. So the question is that amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed to amendment 15. Can I call amendment 26 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on amendment 26. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 26 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 54, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendments 16, 17, 18 and 19? Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move these amendments en bloc?
Moved.
Thank you. Does any member object if we put the questions on 16 to 19 en bloc? No. That's good. So the question is that amendment 16 to 19 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 27 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to a division on amendment 27. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 27 in the name of Mark Roskell is yes 27, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 28, Mark Roskell, to move or not move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division on amendment 28. The result of the vote on amendment number 28 in the name of Mark Roskell is yes 27, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 20, Cabinet Secretary, to move? Moved. Thank you. Can I call amendment 20A in the name of Mark Roskell? Mark Roskell, to move or not move? Not moved. That is not moved. Can I call amendment 20B, Mark Roskell, to move or not moved? Not moved. 20C, not moved. So the question is that amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 29, Mark Roskell, to move or not move? That is not moved. So we're going to turn now to Group 3. This is on convicted persons detained in penal institutions' eligibility to vote. Can I call amendment 30 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings? I would point out at this stage that if amendment 30 is agreed to, I can't call amendment 31. Jamie Halker-Johnson to move amendment 30 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll speak to amendments 30, 34, 35, 37, 38 and 40 in my name. These amendments are largely straightforward and have been explored previously at stage 2. They would remove the existing provisions related to prisoner voting from this bill, replacing them with a proposal for minimum compliance with the Convention rights and rulings of the European Court. I'll not rehearse at length the arguments, but to go beyond what our legal situation necessitates, as the bill currently does, is to fly in the face of public opinion and in contrast with the Scottish Government's previous objections to prisoner voting. A similar objective has been achieved without the need for legislation through guidance to prison governors in England and Wales. Amendment 30 would bind the Scottish Government to take forward the same measures. I have taken cognizance of the Cabinet Secretary's comments at stage 2 that my previous amendment could be seen as tying this Parliament to future changes that may take place in England and Wales. While it is my view that uniformity across the UK is a positive thing in terms of the election franchise, Amendment 30 would not tie this Parliament to any future changes taken elsewhere. My amendments 34, 35, 37, 38 and 39 are consequential amendments to Amendment 30, removing the additional provisions regarding to prisoner voting that Amendment 30 would replace. I will also comment briefly on Amendment 31 in the name of Mark Roskell. His proposal to extend the franchise to prisoners serving sentences of under 4 years is a significant departure from the Scottish Government's view that voting rights should be extended only to less serious offenders. To apply voting rights to those sentenced to under 4 years would catch a wide variety of very serious offenders and move far beyond what even the Scottish Government is proposing. In Amendments 32 and 33, Liam MacArthur has brought forward an amendment that would seek to review the sentence length mentioned in the bill. While I recognise that his inclination is probably to increase the sentence limit, the amendment does not make that presumption. It also allows for a review in relation to the types of offence the prisoner voting provisions apply to, an issue that I have spoken about at earlier stages in the bill. It is welcome that he has removed the provision in his Stage 2 amendments allowing change to the sentence limit to be brought about by secondary legislation. That, I feel, would be an inappropriate power to pass down to secondary legislation. With the above in mind, we are minded to support those amendments. I move amendments in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Johnson. Can I call Mark Roskell to speak to Amendment 31 and the other amendments in this group?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. So I am bringing back this amendment today at Stage 3 to extend prisoner voting to those serving sentences of 4 years and less, because at Stage 2, a number of members voted against it, but only on the basis that they didn't think there was a majority in Parliament, even though they supported it themselves. So I'd like to put this to the test this afternoon by asking the whole chamber to come to a view on it. And it's worth remembering that the Equalities and Human Rights Committee of this Parliament recommended in 2018 that Scottish Government ministers legislate to remove the ban on prisoner voting in its entirety. Those were the words. There will be members here today who signed up to that recommendation and who still believe in it. And I'm asking them to follow through with a more progressive extension of the prisoner voting franchise that is in line with judgments from the European Court of Human Rights. Now, to some in this chamber, our friends over there, this might sound like a horribly radical step. But it was, of course, the norm that most prisoners had the vote before 1969. So perhaps this is more of a return to traditional values. The Greens are the party of tradition, after all. Mr. Tomkins.
Adam Tomkins.
It isn't horribly radical, it's just horrible. What consultation has the member undertaken with victims of crime and their supporters and representatives before bringing this amendment to the Parliament?
Mark Russell.
Well, Mr. Tomkins should recognise that a number of organisations that also work with victims, like SACRO, back this approach. They back this approach as part of rehabilitation. And to be honest, you know, I want to sleep safely in my bed at night as well. You know, I want to know that prisoners have been effectively rehabilitated before they are released back into our community. And that means instilling a social contract back into prisoners you know, that is why we need to see prisoner voting as part of a suite of measures. Because, to be honest, you know, removing the right to vote from prisoners, it doesn't protect the public. It certainly doesn't punish criminal activity. And if anything, it hinders rehabilitation. Because taking away voting rights only weakens the individual's stake in society and respect for its laws. And that's why the likes of SACRO work with offenders. They know what makes offenders tick. They know how to rehabilitate them. And they believe that extending the prisoner voting franchise beyond 1 year is so important. Now, if we're to continue to remove voting rights from prisoners at all, then it has to be proportionate. That is the lesson from numerous legal cases that have challenged the validity of voting bans on prisoners serving more than 1 year. If there's to be a cut-off, then using the sentencing distinctions that are already in place is more proportionate. There is a clear distinction between short-term sentences of less than 4 years and longer-term sentences of more than 4 years. Over 85% of homicides, rapes and attempted rapes result in sentences of more than 4 years. That's where the Welsh Assembly has drawn the line, and that's where we should draw the line too. In terms of Mr. MacArthur's amendments, it does kick the question into the long grass, but it does offer a lifeline should the government face a likely legal challenge and the need to revise this franchise in the future. So we'll not oppose that amendment, we will support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Russell. Can I call Lee MacArthur to speak to Amendment 32 and the other amendments in this group?
Thanks. Today, Parliament will hopefully take the long overdue step of putting an end to the illegal disenfranchisement of all prisoners. It has been clear for some time that stopping all prisoners from voting is not legal, fair, progressive or proportionate. My former colleague Alison McInnes sought 5 years ago to do then what Amendment 31 looks to do now, and accordingly Scottish Liberal Democrats will support Mark Ruskell's amendment. While this may prove unsuccessful, I think it reflects a belief that, welcome though the changes we are seeing in this bill are, we almost certainly will need to go further in future to ensure compliance with our human rights obligations. To that end, I brought forward my own amendments, 32 and 33, which largely mirror ones I lodged at stage 3, while also addressing the concerns that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson rightly mentioned about any provisions coming forward under secondary legislation. These amendments make allowance for a review of this legislation as it relates to prisoner voting. One in a more general review, the other looking specifically at the decision to base the franchise on the length of the sentence as opposed to the nature of the offence. This is because there has been no clear direction from the European Court of Human Rights on what exactly would ensure compliance. We know that a blanket ban is definitely not okay, but rulings from the court have tended towards distinctions based on the individual case. In the current context, though, a future review to reflect again on where the line is has the support of the Howard League of Scotland. Amendment 33 makes clear that actual compliance may only be realised with an offence-based distinction, which both the Howard League of Scotland and the Scottish Human Rights Commission consider right. That said, I recognise the concerns that have been raised by the Cabinet Secretary today and indeed at stage 2, and thank him for his engagement since stage 2 on my amendments. I welcome his support for the more general review proposed in Amendment 32 and agree that I think this would be more helpfully carried out when we have the evidence not just from the next Scottish Parliament election but also from the local authority elections thereafter. And on that basis my manuscript amendment seeks to move the deadline for the review to 2023 rather than 12 months after the next national election in Scotland. Finally, in relation to the other amendments in this group, I'm conscious that the Scottish Human Rights Commission has made clear that, quote, the ECHR defines the floor rather than ceiling on human rights protection. On that basis, I would suggest that Jamie Halcrow-Johnston's amendments belong in the basement. There is no credible reason to reduce the scope of prisoner voting in the way proposed by Mr Halcrow-Johnston. If Scotland is to aim high on human rights, that is not an agenda we should be following, and Scottish Liberal Democrats will therefore be opposing those amendments this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I call James Kelly to be followed by Gil Patterson?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The amendments in this group deal with one of the central issues in the bill, which is the extension of the franchise to prisoners. It obviously comes on the back of the European Court ruling, which originally was set in 2005. So this is an issue that's been around for a long time, and it's therefore correct that the Parliament takes a proper view on this. I think to continue to ignore the European Court ruling is a position that was unsustainable. Scottish Labour supports the position as set out in the bill for an extension of the franchise to those serving 12 months or less. I think that's right and proportionate. From that point of view, we don't support Mark Ruskell's position of extending it to 4 years. I believe that Jamie Halcrow, the Tory amendment, basically... Jamie Halcrow-Johnston's... These double-barrel names, you know. I believe that amendment seeks to, introduce minimal compliance with the European Court ruling, but I don't think it respects it. And I think if we're going to be a modern Parliament and a progressive Parliament, we need to interact properly with that court ruling. I support. I'll take the intervention.
Liam Kerr. It's just very briefly on that point. Does the member accept then that the government is going further than it is required to do under the Hurst case and doesn't need to go there?
James Kelly.
Well, as I just said, Mr Kerr, I think if we're going to be a proper, progressive and modern Parliament, we require to consider these issues. And I'll develop this more in my stage 1 speech. We require to consider these issues as the evidence develops. The government have done this. Scottish Labour have looked at that, and I believe that the position that we've arrived at is the correct one. As I was going on to say, there are a lot of issues around this, and there's some complexities. And from that point of view, I think it's right to support Liam MacArthur's amendments 32 and 33, supporting a review once the legislation is implemented and we've seen how it operates during the course of actual elections. I think that allows proper reflection, and any appropriate changes can then be made.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. And I call Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I would like to say a few words on eligibility to vote. And I was particularly concerned, I am concerned about the number of women that are in prisons. And so therefore, the one-year status fits the way that I think, although I do also think some women are in prison and they shouldn't actually be in prison in the first place because of the low level of the type of crime. And these crimes are normally committed to feed their families. And so they shouldn't be there in the first place. But at 1 year, I'm comfortable with that. However, I'm one of the switchers when it came to the 4-year status, and taking soundings from different places, I changed my mind on the basis that 4-year would include people who committed sexual offences, some of them serious. So therefore, in my view, that threshold is too high. So I'll be up front. Yes.
Can I thank Mr Patterson for giving way? My understanding is that even crimes of up to 1 year sentencing will also involve people who have been convicted on the basis of sexual crimes. So we will be enfranchising people who have committed sexual crimes even at 1 year.
Gil Patterson.
Yeah, I actually appreciate that. I appreciate that point, and I'm glad you make it. But it's the seriousness of them. Serious sexual offence crimes can come under the 4 year threshold, whereas the years, it's a very, very low threshold type of crime. So that's why I changed my mind, and I now support. Please.
School Hamilton.
I'm very grateful to Gil Patterson for giving way. I understand his point, and he is right to say that sexual offences will carry with them a range of sentencing and aftercare support as well. But at no point in sentencing for any crime, sexual or otherwise, is it a reference made to the franchise. It's an entirely arbitrary proposition. You could be sentenced for 3 years in prison for the same crime and miss no elections. Then for the same crime be sentenced for 3 years again and miss 9 elections, as we had between 2014 and 2017. It isn't linked to sentencing, so why should it be linked to the offence?
Gil Patterson.
Well, the evidence that we heard in the committee was it's very, very difficult to have a level playing field, and it would be based on judges making different decisions on individuals themselves. So you would get back to the same place that you're talking about, that for the same crime someone could and other people escape that crime and the consequences of it. So anyway, I support the changes that the government are making in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Patterson. Can I call on the Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This group encompasses, as we've heard, 2 distinct proposals as how do we achieve ECHR compliance in terms of prisoner voting. And I want to just say a word about each in turn before turning to Mr MacArthur's proposal. At stage 2, Mr Harcourt-Johnson suggested that instead of designing our own distinct proposal, we should instead apply the guidance in operation in England and Wales. Amendment 30 actually seeks to achieve the same aim, but this time by express provision allowing only those prisoners on temporary release on licence on polling day to vote. While this amendment would not tie us to any future changes to Ministry of Justice guidance in the same way as his previous attempt did, the UK government, there are still many concerns. The UK government's response to the European Court of Human Rights case law on prisoner voting did not enfranchise any prisoners in custody, but instead focused on clarifying how those on temporary release could exercise their existing voting rights. This Parliament has to make our own assessment on the appropriate response to seek to strike the correct balance for Scotland, as Mr Kelly has rightly asserted. We have our own justice system with different temporary release rules, and we need to make our own assessment of what is needed for ECHR compliance, just as the Welsh Government and every other member of the Council of Europe has done. Indeed, many have argued that the approach of the UK Government is inadequate. At the very least, we should consider the assessment, for example, of Welsh Equality, Local Government and Communities Committee last June, which said in their report, we cannot take lightly the concerns raised that the current approach by the UK Government of minimal compliance may not continue to be sufficient for the future. Of course.
Madam Tomkins.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Will he not accept, however, that the Council of Europe, whose flag is still flown outside this building, the Council of Europe have accepted that the UK's minimal compliance is exactly that. It is compliance. And the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, having examined the United Kingdom government's response to this question, has closed its examination of the execution of the Hurst judgment, meaning that the United Kingdom complies with international human rights law in this area.
Well, that is an interesting point, but Mr Tomkins knows better than I do as a lawyer that that is not the same as surviving a challenge on the issue. And much of the opinion is that the UK government would not survive a challenge on this issue. Mr MacArthur's point about the basement is indeed a good analogy. If this is challenged and falls, then we would be in the same position. It is far better, Mr Kerry is wrong about this, it is far better to go into a position which we believe is resistant to challenge than to go into a position which the UK government, it looks as if it is vulnerable to challenge. And that is an important issue here. Now, I demonstrated our belief that urgent action is now essential last August when I made a convention compliance order to allow limited prisoner voting in the Shetland Islands by-election. I've repeatedly welcomed the unanimous agreement of the Standards Committee in its Stage 1 report that the blanket ban is unsustainable, as it's in odds with the European Convention on Human Rights. The 12-month threshold set out in the bill is the government's considered response on the issue, reached following consultation and deliberation by not one but two parliamentary committees. It has a direct link to a key aspect of the Scottish justice system, the sentence threshold for courts sitting without a jury. It was the option that had the greatest support in the consultation. So I invite members to vote against Amendments 30, 34, 35, 37, 38 and 40. Let me turn to Mr Ruskell's Amendment 31. It seeks to enfranchise all prisoners serving sentences of 4 years or less. I understand the arguments. Members will be familiar with them from Stage 2. I've just said how the bill's proposal of 12 months has a solid grounding in the consultation and in our justice system in terms of sentencing. It also ties in with our new presumption, and it is a presumption, against sentences under a year. It might assist members in considering these thresholds to have some prison population data. On Tuesday this week, there were 811 prisoners who would have been enfranchised by the one-year threshold, and 3,156 who would have been enfranchised by a four-year threshold. That was from a total population of 6,475 convicted prisoners in custody. I remain convinced, and I'm very pleased to hear Mr Patterson confirm his own view, which was a changed view from a previous view, as he says, that 12 months is the best choice on the basis of the substantial nature of the changes and the consultation and the Scottish legal system. And therefore, I would invite Mr Ruskell not to press Amendment 31. Finally, let me turn to Liam MacArthur's Amendments 32 to 33. I accept the merits of the case put forward by the member for seeking a route for further consideration of the test for prisoner voting. This bill is making a historic change. I agree, remember, that a review would be valuable. I'm grateful to Mr MacArthur for accepting my suggestion that any review should be able to take into account experience not just at the Scottish Parliament election, but at the 2022 local government elections. I'm therefore pleased to support Amendment 32 as modified by Amendment 32A, which will result that the review report must be delivered by the 4th of May 2023, which would mean that both sets of elections could be considered. I welcome that Mr MacArthur has changed or intends to change Amendment 32, which is focused on the threshold, rather than Amendment 33. That amendment raised the possibility of tying the test to specific types of offence. Presiding Officer, we considered very seriously that approach, but our consultation paper highlighted that two offences of the same type can attract substantially different sentences. So we will support Amendment 32 and the manuscript amendment in Amendment 32A. So I invite members to do the same, but I cannot accept the other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And could I invite Jamie Halker-Johnson to wind up on this group and to press or withdraw Amendment 30?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Only just briefly to mention in relation to Mark Ruskell's point about rehabilitation. Of course, his amendment would allow prisoners to vote on day one of their sentences before any rehabilitation may have taken place. And while I'm sorry that we'll be standing alone against prisoner voting in this place, I believe we do so on the side of the vast majority of people, members of the public, outside of here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. Move to a division on Amendment 30. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 30 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson is yes 28, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 31 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 31 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division on amendment 31. The result of the vote on amendment number 31 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 10, no 106. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 32 in the name of Liam MacArthur? Liam MacArthur to move or not move? Thank you. Can I call amendment 32A, Liam MacArthur to move?
Moved.
That is moved. So the question is that amendment 32A be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the question is that amendment 32 as amended now be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 33 in the name of Liam MacArthur? Liam MacArthur to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. Can I call amendment 34, Jamie Halker-Johnson to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to division on amendment 34. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 34 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson is yes 28, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 35, Jamie Halker-Johnson to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to division on amendment 35. The result of the vote on amendment number 35 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson is yes 28, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 4, election meetings on prison estates, and I call amendment 36 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson in a group on its own. Jamie Halker-Johnson to move and speak to amendment 36.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 36 expands upon an earlier amendment at stage 2 and relates to electoral meetings on the prison estate. The amendment has two main functions. The first would ensure that candidates are not unfairly disadvantaged by not attending an election event on the prison estate. There are many conceivable reasons why a candidate may have objections to seeking votes in prison. He or she may be a victim of crime themselves, for instance. To have them placed at a disadvantage because of that objection would be wrong. The amendment would allow candidates to campaign in prisons only with the consent of the other candidates they are opposing in their ward or constituency. At stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary equated my proposals with the provisions in the Representation of the People Act regarding hustings and the use of community facilities. The amendment is in fact quite different and reflects the unique circumstances that this bill would bring about. As has been outlined, the bill would genuinely require prisoners to register to vote at their previous residences rather than the constituency the prison is located in. The amendments take account of this and applies a right to be informed of election meetings to candidates in the constituency where the prison is sited. But its key component is to require the approval of all candidates in a constituency or ward for an election meeting in a prison to take place that any one of them is proposing to attend. This will effectively ensure that all candidates in a particular electoral race are satisfied before any sort of campaigning can take place in prison, ensuring they are on a level playing field. In terms of regional candidates, the need to seek the agreement of all candidates on the regional list, which I recognise would be a burdensome threshold to reach, will only apply where a candidate is standing solely on a regional list and not in a constituency. This will provide proper and fair protection to candidates who may not wish to campaign on the prison estate. The second element of my amendment is to require a risk assessment to be made of any such meeting on the prison estate. This will ensure that prison governors can take necessary steps to ensure the safety of all concerned, whether candidates, prison staff or prisoners. Elections can be emotionally heated, and it would be unsurprising if political or other election events became a focal point for crime and disorder in a prison setting. The amendment is also clear that its provisions extend only to candidates operating in furtherance of their candidacy in an election. This would not impact on elected members meeting with constituents in prisons or place any additional hurdles to supporting or communicating with people serving time in prison. I move Amendment 36.
Thank you very much. Mr Halker-Johnson. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by James Kelly.
Thanks very much, President Officer. Amendment 36 is a rather curious beast. It masquerades as compassionate, drawing on the principles of the Representation of the People Act. But on closer inspection, it is nothing of the sort. I see no evidence in that Act for what is in effect a right to veto political interactions with potential voters. There is precedent for regulation around the use of publicly owned spaces for electioneering, and there is room for risk assessment and proper guidance to make sure that meetings held within prison spaces are safe and indeed fair. Governors already have obligations in relation to the safety and integrity of what happens within our prisons. If further guidance is required, it seems to me that the Scottish Prison Service and the Electoral Commission are best placed to address that. In essence, as with the amendments in the previous grouping, this is effectively a wrecking amendment and will not have Scottish Liberal Democrat support.
Thank you. And I call James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to oppose the amendment in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson. I'm glad Adam Tomkins is cheering my opposition. I think if you look at the logic of the legislation, which is going to be considered in full at 5 o'clock, up until now the position is that the legislation is that we're extending the franchise to include prisoner voting, and therefore that's in addition to the electorate, and that should be respected as such, and that group of voters should be able to not just vote in the election but participate in the democratic process. An essential part of the democratic process are election meetings, and the amendment that's been lodged is in effect a veto, to block that process where one candidate could pull out and stop the important process of democratic engagement. So I don't think it adds anything to the important aspects we're discussing this afternoon in terms of extending the franchise and improving the democratic process.
Thank you. I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have some sympathy with the points that Liam MacArthur makes. This is superficially attractive, but there are huge issues beneath it. Mr Harker-Johnson did lodge a similar amendment at stage 2, and I said that that's how it sought to resolve an issue that's not likely to arise, but did risk creating uncertainty and a disproportionate burden upon the Scottish Prison Service. I appreciate where Mr Harker-Johnson appears to be coming from. Hustings can be an intimidating process for any candidate. I'm sympathetic to the members concerned for candidates who have been victims of crime. But I don't believe that seeking to mirror existing law in electoral meetings in schools or community rooms is either the solution or indeed appropriate. The situation for prisoners is different. It's reasonable to assume that those attending a community centre hustings reside nearby and are considering the same set of candidates. But I think Mr Harker-Johnson has misunderstood the bill. We cannot make that assumption with prisoners, as they will largely be registered at their home address and not at the prison address. Now, it's true that the Scottish Prison Service has said they will attempt to accommodate these meetings, but they shouldn't be attempted to administer them, particularly when the burden could be huge. Because the amendment compels prison governors to seek the consent of a range of different, inverted commas, relevant candidates, depending who requests a meeting. If several different candidates made a request, the government would be expected by this amendment to check each constituency or ward or region in question, identify the relevant candidates, and then set about obtaining the consent of every person before a meeting could be held. This won't be just 4 candidates or 8 candidates. Given that one prison could hold prisoners from anywhere in Scotland, this could involve governors in dozens of notes of consent. That is disproportionate, if nothing else. It's simply not appropriate for prison governors to be expected to identify and contact that number of candidates in this way. Not only do these arrangements cut across the agreement of prison authorities to engage, they add a complex, unnecessary bureaucratic burden. I said at stage 2 that was simply unnecessary. I remain firmly of that view, and I do not support Amendment 36.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Jamie Halgood-Johnson to wind up in this group.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Lee MacArthur suggests that it isn't a veto. James Kelly suggests that it is a veto, so they can't both be right, or maybe they're just both wrong. And the issues that the Cabinet Secretary raised and highlighted there come about from his government's proposals to allow prisoner voting, and I think those are sensible. It is a sensible amendment which protects those people who, as has been highlighted, may not want to, but may feel obliged to campaign in a prison should that option be put forward to them. So I will move the amendment.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division. This will be a 1-minute division. Members, they vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 36 in the name of Jamie Halgood-Johnson is yes 28, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 37, previously debated, Jamie Halgood-Johnson to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division on amendment 37. This is the 32nd vote. The result of the vote on amendment number 37 in the name of Jamie Halgood-Johnson is yes 27, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 38, Jamie Halgood-Johnson to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 38 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division on amendment 38. The result of the vote on amendment number 38 in the name of Jamie Halgood-Johnson is yes 27, no 88. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 5. review of the Act. Can I call Amendment 39 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson in a group on its own, and Jamie Halker-Johnson to move and speak to Amendment 39?
This amendment requires a review of the effect of the bill to take place in the next election following its enactment. In regard to both foreign national voters and prisoner voting, the bill will make a significant change to the electoral franchise. These will require new rules and working practices, as well as making a substantial difference to how our democracy works in practice. It is right that these changes are properly reviewed by the Scottish Government and conclusions are brought before this Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary has previously observed that the Electoral Commission will produce a report following each election to this Parliament. My amendment proposes a review that is both narrower and in more depth. It can, of course, draw on the findings of the Electoral Commission and could and should be based on wide and active consultation with the Commission and other bodies. This review would look specifically at the effect of this bill and the changes that are made. It will involve a full response from the Scottish Government on the bill's effects, which will complement, not detract from, the report of the Independent Electoral Commission. Given the gravity of the changes we are debating today, I believe this is an important step in ensuring that proper scrutiny of these proposals can be given, and I move Amendment 39.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Once again, Mr Halker-Johnson is returning to an issue that he first raised at stage 2. I appreciate he has revised his initial proposal, but I remain strongly of the view that Amendment 39 is not only unnecessary, it is undesirable, given that it overlaps with the statutory role of the Electoral Commission. It is their role as an independent body to review the conduct of the Scottish Parliament and local government elections, not the government's role. Looking back to their report on the 2016 Holyrood election, there is detailed information on electoral integrity, public engagement, registration, turnout, candidates and electoral fraud. These are the same issues that Mr Halker-Johnson is now seeking to require the Scottish Government to review. Moreover, I am concerned that this proposal implies that the bill risks undermining the security of our elections. Election professionals, including the Electoral Commission and electoral registration officers, have been involved in the development and implementation planning of this bill from its earliest stages. Our consultation received 268 responses before it closed in March 2019. These were analysed and considered throughout the policy development process. I can think of no particular reason why the enfranchisement of either foreign nationals or prisoners would have a detrimental impact on the security of Scottish elections, which is the issue being addressed. Finally, this Parliament has just agreed, and if the bill passes, will have definitively agreed on a review on Mr MacArthur's Amendments 32A and 32. And for all those reasons, I can't support Amendment 39.
Thank you. And James Kelly.
Briefly, Presiding Officer, I'm convinced of supporting the amendment in this case. I appreciate that you can't have a review of every piece of legislation, but as we've seen in the debate this afternoon, there are complexities and material changes around the franchise here that are important, and I don't think we should be afraid of that review. We should take forward the changes confidently, but we should also look to see that they've been implemented effectively and make any changes that are required. So we will support.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. So Jamie Halker-Johnson to wind up and to press a withdrawal of this Amendment 39.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just to thank James Kelly for his support and agree with him in terms of the material changes. And as I said to the Cabinet Secretary at stage 2, I'm not sure why we shouldn't be looking at this, given the importance of the changes that we've made and obviously the depth that we've been calling here for in this amendment. So I move the amendment.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 39 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division on Amendment 39. It's a 1-minute division. The result of the vote on amendment number 39 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson is yes 47, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And can I call amendment 40 in the name of Jamie Halker-Johnson? Jamie Halker-Johnson to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. And that ends consideration of amendments. Now, at this stage, members will be aware, be very familiar by now, that I'm required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of this bill relates to a protected subject matter. That is, whether it modifies the electoral system and franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In my view, provisions for the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill do relate to the protected subject matter of the persons entitled to vote as electors at an election for membership of the Parliament. Therefore, for the first time in the Scottish Parliament, this bill requires a supermajority to be passed. That means that 86 members, that is 2/3 of the number of seats, are required to vote for the bill for it to be passed at stage 3 when we reach decision time. 86 members, 2/3. Now, on that note, I'm actually going to suspend business for 5 minutes for a short comfort break. 5 minutes suspension before we resume the debate. Parliament is suspended.
The next item of business is Stage 3 debate on motion 20922 in the name of Michael Russell on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and could I inform members at the outset that we are very short of time and it may be the case that decision time will be later than 5 o'clock. I call on Mike Russell to speak to and move the motion. For up to 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank all the members who have engaged with the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill today and throughout its parliamentary progress. My thanks go to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for its scrutiny and to electoral professionals for sharing their expertise. Many others, such as the Scottish Prison Service and the Scottish Refugee Council, have worked constructively with the Government to develop what is historic legislation. And it has two significant aspects. One is the expansion of the franchise, I'll come to in a moment, but the second one is the issue of prisoner voting. 15 years ago, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights stated in its Hertz judgment, "The right to vote is not a privilege. In the 21st century, the presumption in a democratic state must be in favour of inclusion." Member States of the Council of Europe are offered a margin of appreciation about how they achieve ECHR compliance, and each country has adopted its own position. Governments in Wales and at Westminster have taken their own views, based on their own circumstances. I have highlighted that the very limited approach of the UK Government only allows those on temporary release on polling day to vote. And whilst I accept the point that Mr Tomkins has made about the Council of Europe, it has not yet been tested in court. We are not here today, however, to speculate on the outcome of such a test, but rather our duty is to take action as proportionate, justifiable and tailored to our system. In 2016, the Equalities and Human Rights Committee recommended all prisoners should have the right to vote. Last year, the Standards Committee did not reach a consensus, and we have discussed a variety of proposals as the bill has progressed. This bill, if passed, will set the threshold for prisoner voting at those serving sentences of 12 months or less. 12 months was the most popular response in our consultation. It has a firm basis in our justice system. It's the maximum sentence which can be imposed in a case heard without a jury. I remind members that this, for the first time in Holyrood's history, as the presiding officer reminded us before we adjourn briefly, this is a bill that will need the support of 2/3 of all members elected to this Parliament. Not a majority, but 2/3 of all members elected to this Parliament in order to be passed. But if the bill were not to pass tonight, we would still be obliged to ensure that all future parliamentary elections are ECHR compliant. A remedial order was required last year to bring the franchise for the Shetland by-election into line with the Convention. It wasn't a move I wished to take, but I felt compelled to take. Without this bill, we would have no choice but to lay another order in respect of prisoner voting in Scottish Parliament elections. I don't want to take such an action unless it is absolutely unavoidable. Prisoner voting is an important, emotive issue. I recognise that. It's one where I want to see a settled will of this Parliament, and I hope it will be reflected tonight. While the bill's provisions on prisoners are driven by a compelling need to meet human rights obligations, our proposals on foreign nationals are driven by the reality and, I believe, the aspiration of modern Scottish society. EU and Commonwealth citizens already have the franchise, but we must also recognise the enormous contribution brought to our country by people from all over the world. That is why we are extending the right to vote in devolved elections to all foreign nationals resident in Scotland who have leave to remain. Some have argued in this chamber, and I no doubt will argue this evening, that voting should be rooted in strictly traditional ideas of citizenship. I believe it must be based on active participation in society. The extension of voting rights is especially meaningful in the atmosphere of uncertainty surrounding the UK Government's plans for the immigration system. Of course.
Adam Tomkins.
To the Cabinet Secretary. I think this is a really important point that he's moved on to. And my question to him is this. If the link between the franchise and citizenship is to be broken, and in this bill it will be broken, and we can take different views about that, but if the link between the franchise and citizenship is to be broken, what is citizenship for?
I think that is a very interesting question, and Mr Tomkins raised it at a previous stage in such a debate, and I would be happy to have that debate. But I am happier, given the circumstances we're in at the moment and the atmosphere of uncertainty of Brexit and immigration reform, to essentially recognise that the need is there for change. But that does not exclude the debate that Mr Tomkins wants to have, and I'd be happy to have that debate. And that is part of the debate about modernising our society. I would argue perhaps it is best expressed by having a modern nation to have that modern debate. And I don't believe we presently live in a modern nation, given where the UK is. But I don't want to dismiss that. I simply am not going to enter into the debate now because I don't have the full answer to it. But we do have an answer in terms of what we are attempting to do to modernise Scottish society. We have tried also to cut through that uncertainty with proposals for a new Scottish visa. But as members will know, in a modern society, Scotland may accept that, but the UK has dismissed it with contempt. Now, that only serves to underline the importance of using the powers we have to send the message that Scotland is opening, welcoming, and home to all those who choose to settle here. I'm very pleased to have brought forward a bill which sends that message to the refugee community. I do regret that we have not been able to find a workable way of extending voting rights to asylum seekers at this time. But I hope that that will not lead to any accusations that we either do not wish to try and do so, or we in some way are dismissive or contemptuous of asylum seekers, nor that we are timid. We are going much further than almost any other country has done. That should be recognised and celebrated. The issue of who could stand as a candidate is related to that. There is a logic to the idea that candidacy rights should reflect voting rights, but the bill's passage has illustrated it's not so straightforward to achieve. We cannot, for example, pass legislation which affects the employment status of or capacity of foreign nationals in the UK. We would take ourselves out with legislative competence. I would like to be permanently within legislative competence because this Parliament would have all the powers, but we are presently where we are. But following stage 2, we have identified areas in which we could and rightly go further, and we have brought them into this bill. For example, with EU nationals with settled status could stand as candidates under the bill as introduced, those with pre-settled status could not. But these people are European Economic Area nationals, and as a result of which we've been able to take this forward in a progressive way. To conclude, Presiding Officer, this bill, I hope, reflects the reality of modern Scotland. But no franchise is static. All franchises continue to grow and expand and develop, and no doubt back in this chamber at some stage, perhaps in the not too distant future, there will be continued franchise reform. I hope those reforms continue to reflect what this bill reflects: a Scotland committed to the treaties that safeguard our human rights, that wants to give a democratic voice to some of the most marginalised in our communities, and one that welcomes those who seek to join our society. To make that vision a reality today, we require the support of 86 members. And I hope the members will recognise that that is something they wish to be part of and vote for the first time in a supermajority division. And I move that the Parliament agrees that the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill be passed.
I call Jamie Halcrow-Johnson for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary has stated, the bill presented before us today has two major functions: reforming the franchise in relation to residency and nationality, and bringing about prisoner voting. As someone who is engaged with this bill at all stages, I'd like to again extend my thanks to the legislation team and to the Standards Committee clerking team for all their support as we've progressed. There is, of course, a far longer history behind our consideration of prisoner voting. We'll be conscious of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, which looms over the choices that we make. But there are equally members of this chamber who have a sincere and long-standing commitment to enfranchising criminals who are still serving their sentences. On that point, as I'll come to, I straightforwardly disagree. Looking back, we can consider the period in the run-up to the 2014 independence referendum, where SNP members lined up to condemn prisoner voting and to object to the decision of the European Court. In 2013, the now First Minister refused to countenance this, saying, and I quote, "If somebody commits a crime which lands them in prison, they break their contract with society. Therefore, they lose some of the rights the rest of us take for granted." Unbelievably, I agreed with him. That is a position that many people beyond this chamber still hold. Indeed, it's a popular one, as the former Justice Secretary Kenny McCaskill, now a newly elected SNP MP, recognised. He believed that prisoner voting was, it seems, the right thing to do, but instead the arguments within the corridors of St Andrew's House seemed to be solely against, focused as they were on newspaper headlines and the effect on the opinion polls ahead of the referendum vote. Mr McCaskill called the position shameful, and as we find ourselves here today, we can see why. Now, as I've said, many members and parties have sincere and moral positions in relation to prisoner voting. In some cases, this is absolute, in other cases qualified. Some believe that it should be restricted to less serious offenders or those undergoing rehabilitation with a view to soon re-entering the community. For others, compliance with the decision of the European Court is the material point. This bill, as it stands, does a poor job of satisfying any of these points. It does not address rehabilitation. It does not simply implement the decisions of the court, and it does not successfully exclude people who may have received relatively short sentences but committed significant and unpleasant crimes. If we are to accept the argument of the European Court that a blanket ban is a disproportionate interference with human rights, we should perhaps reflect on the circumstances here in Scotland. To be sentenced to imprisonment here, even for a relatively short period, generally means that a serious offence has been committed, or a person has a lengthy history of more moderate offending that has reached a head. This already contains a built-in proportionality test. But if we must accept the ruling of the court, and the Scottish Government has been reticent on that point for many years, we should not gold-plate the requirements that the ECHR places on us. The UK Government has accepted, unhappily, that some movement has to be made on prisoner voting. They have set out a position that I would be tempted to term as minimal compliance, and it is one that the Council of Europe has accepted. The Scottish Government has not accepted that position and voted against it today. There can be little hiding from the fact that this bill will bring prisoners into our elections, and it will be a consequence of a decision made here in Holyrood, not one of compliance with a court in Strasbourg. As I've said, many simply disagree that prisoners, people who have stepped beyond the rules set by our society, should have the right to vote for those who set those rules, while they are still being punished and still have yet to be rehabilitated and reintegrated into our community. That rehabilitation is necessarily a process, but it's not one that is complete on day one of a short sentence. But even if the bill is to pass today, there are several things that we could have done to make it safer. I've pressed 2 amendments today, one which was a common-sense approach to ensure that any election events taking place on the prison estate as a result of this bill are safe and do not disadvantage candidates who, for a variety of reasons, might not wish to campaign in a prison setting. It also ensured that proper risk assessments would be carried out, with prison governors given a role to protect candidates, prisoners and prison staff. The second was a review of the bill's effects after the next round of elections. We should be mindful of the significance of changing our electoral franchise materially, and believe that it's only right that it's given the proper post-legislative attention that it merits. To turn to the issue of franchise and particularly foreign national voters, there are necessarily arguments on both sides. In some cases, residents may demonstrate an attachment to place. However, it seems to me that citizenship is not an irrelevant consideration. For those who come to Scotland and live here for a sufficient amount of time, gaining citizenship demonstrates not only a right to residence, but also an involvement with the civic life of the country. Presiding officer, today will mark the end of a rather uncomfortable process, one where convicted prisoners spending time in jail are brought in as part of our democracy. There might be some who will pay little attention to this. The numbers involved, just over 900 spread around Scotland, may well not have a huge influence on the results of any given election. But it's also one where this SNP government has, in forcing through prisoner voting, U-turned on its previous position, jettisoned its own principles, and put itself firmly at odds with the views of the voters we in this place serve.
Thank you. And just before I call James Kelly, I can advise the Chamber that decision time is likely to be moved until 5:15 p.m. I'll advise better nearer the time, but the division bell will ring accordingly. Now call James Kelly for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to open the Stage 3 debate for Scottish Labour in this important piece of legislation. There are 2 central parts to it. The extension of the franchise to include nationals who are now resident in Scotland, and prisoner voting, which has been subject to much debate this afternoon. I think in terms of prisoner voting, it's actually important to kind of reflect back on what's happened in terms of the Parliament over the last 6-7 years, because this was actually considered ahead of the 2014 referendum, and the government opposed at that time any extension to include prisoner voting. Scottish Labour supported that. I actually spoke in the debate from the position that Mr Halcrow Johnson sits at. I opposed it. So I suppose the fair challenge to me and to the government must be, you know, what's happened to change that position. And there are two kind of central reasons that I would submit. First of all, the European Court judgment. I know that was around at the time of the previous debate. The bottom line was various governments, including the UK and Scottish government, kind of danced around it and delayed any kind of proper interaction with that judgment. The reality is, you know, that position can't sustain, and, you know, we need to put in place a proper solution that does extend the franchise to include at least some prisoners. And I believe it's got to be a serious and proportionate response, not one that was put forward in the Tory amendment. Just let me make this point on the Tory amendment of just allowing those who are out in licence to participate in the elections. Mr Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
Why, Mr Kelly? Why do you think that you can't just stop at that level?
Well, that was
James Kelly.
That's what I was going on to develop, because I'm trying to be helpful. What I've said is that I opposed this in 2013. I've said the reason that I've changed my position is that I believe you've got to seriously interact with that judgment. And the second reason that I would give Mr Kerr is that I've been in the justice portfolio previously. I've returned to it recently, but I've observed a lot of the justice debates, and even what strikes me is even in the Tory benches, there is a lot of call for support and rehabilitation, and I believe that as well as you know, observing the judgment, I think that treating prisoners with 12 months less of a sentence, giving them a vote in the election, helps the process of trying to establish them as more responsible citizens who will greater contribute to society when they leave. So I think that's a reasonable contribution with all the other rehabilitation techniques that we speak about in this chamber. So for those reasons, I believe, and Scottish Labour believes, that the position that's established in the bill that comes before us at 5 o'clock is the correct one. I think in terms of the extension to nationals resident in Scotland, that is also logical. I think if people stay here, they reside here, they contribute to our economies, they contribute to our communities, they work in caring professions like the health service, then it's only right that we extend that to allow them to participate in the elections, participate in the democratic process, and have a choice in the representatives that are picked, and also the government that is elected. The final point, and I'll probably expand on this more when I'm summing up, is that allied to all these things, I think there needs to be a process of voter registration and voter education. But in summing up, this is important legislation, as Mr Russell quite rightly says. It needs a 2/3 majority at 5 o'clock, and I hope the Parliament will deliver that majority of at least 86 MSPs to support it.
Mark Ruskell, for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This bill obviously delivers important protections to the right of EU citizens, Commonwealth citizens, and an extension of rights to refugees and others who have residency within the UK. And of course, we warmly welcome that on these benches. It is a tangible extension of rights, but also an important symbol of how we increasingly define citizenship in Scotland based on residency. The government has rightly used powers granted to the Parliament under the 2016 Scotland Act, but I remain disappointed where it has not pushed right up to the limits of devolution by extending franchise and candidacy rights further. There will still be barriers between the rights of people in our communities, barriers that act against integration. And some of these barriers, some of them, not all of them, but some of these barriers will be choices of this Parliament that have been made this afternoon. It's nothing to do with immigration status, but it is to do with a clear flinch away from administrative complexity. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has said repeatedly throughout the progress of this bill that the best is the enemy of the good. But I think it was clear in the vote on the extension of the franchise to asylum seekers this afternoon that there would have been a supermajority in favour of the change if the government had actively chosen to resolve the policy complexities in advance. These were flagged up months ago, and it surely can't be beyond the capabilities of government to work with EROs and take a 55,000-person franchise extension and add a further 5,000 people who have similar residency status issues to the rest of them. But I mean, the Cabinet Secretary will be relieved to hear that I'm ready to move on, though, with this issue now. But I hope that the government are too, because the debate about asylum seeker voting rights has been important. But of course, democracy is not just about single electoral events selecting representatives. It's also about participation. And maybe community councils could be opened up to asylum seekers who are resident in communities but who are not on the electoral register. Maybe citizens' juries and assemblies can include asylum seekers. Maybe the government can find a way to revisit the issue of the franchise sooner than later. Now, on candidacy rights, if I've got time, yeah. I don't have time, sorry. I don't have time.
But,
on candidacy rights...
Excuse me, I don't remember actually answering. So, yes, I can give you time, Adam Tomkins.
Okay, I'll let Mr Tomkins.
It's a very short question. Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to the member for giving way. How can somebody who isn't a citizen play a meaningful role in something called a citizens' assembly?
Mark Ruskell.
Well, because they're resident, and if we have a citizenship based largely on resident, the fact is that they are in communities, they have views, they access services, they contribute to society, they have views, they have voices. We want to hear what their voices are because they might actually make our society a better place to live in for them and for the rest of us, Mr Tomkins. Now, on candidacy rights, the concerns about those with limited leave to remain not seeing out terms, again I see as a red herring. Many people are granted repeated periods of temporary leave to remain over many years. And in many ways, they're in a similar set of circumstances to those who face financial or health insecurities but still stand for election. Diverse, proportional electoral systems with lists and multi-member constituencies can handle departures, whatever the particular cause might be. On prisoner voting, the one-year cut-off point is open to challenge, and if the government was confident of its position in this bill, then it probably would not have accepted Mr MacArthur's amendment to keep the door ajar. There will be now many who will be watching this space, I'm sure some who will consider jumping into it. Finally, Presiding Officer, I can just address the issue of candidacy rights for young people between the age of 16 and 18. I'm in no doubt of the capabilities of young people in leading our world, and you only have to see the contrast between Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump to see that maturity and childishness can take unexpected forms. I recognise, though, that matching the franchise with candidacy rights for young people requires careful thought and consideration, especially when it comes to safeguarding issues. The thinking has started, and I hope the next government can be bold and formally revisit this. Indeed, the whole process of electoral reform and revitalisation of our democracy has barely begun. There's much work to do. It will require vision, a bold government, and a parliament willing to challenge and push the boundaries further and further.
I call Liam MacArthur for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged earlier, inclusion has been a common theme through the course of this debate and indeed earlier debates on this bill. I'm grateful, therefore, to have an opportunity to contribute on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and pay tribute, like others have, to the Standards Committee for their efforts in leading the way in the scrutiny of this important legislation. Deputy Presiding Officer, we need only cast our minds back to the last Parliament, where amendments on prisoner voting from my colleague Alison McInnes were twice voted down, to see how far has been travelled to reach this point. And I very much acknowledge the candour shown by James Kelly in talking about his own journey in this respect. This legislation bears witness to the fact that even the most hardened narratives can be shifted if there are people willing to make arguments, make the case that isn't always easy or indeed popular. In a week where self-defeating immigration policies rooted in what I believe is xenophobia have been brought forward, that is an important point to remember and indeed hope to cling to. The UK is a nation of immigrants, and we should be proud that people want to come to our country and work in our NHS, in our schools, and be part of our society. Those who want to make Scotland their home should be helped in their efforts to make a contribution to their new community. If someone has been forced to flee their home to escape war and persecution, they should not be confronted with needless barriers to integration. We should be tearing down walls, not building them. Extending voting to those who are legally here will help in a small but important way to do just that. Diversity in the UK should be celebrated, and our political institutions draw strength from the extent to which they reflect the people they are there to represent. Scottish Liberal Democrats are internationalists. We believe passionately in the values of human rights, democracy and equality. I'm hopeful that this bill will be an important part in progressing those values within this country. In relation to prisoner voting, it's quite clear that the current blanket ban flouts international law. The truth is, no other developed European democracy does it. It's not fair, it's not progressive, nor indeed in the interests of rehabilitation, as we heard earlier this afternoon. We know that to reduce reoffending, we need to make people more aware of their responsibility as citizens rather than alienating them further. I'm not entirely convinced that drawing a line at 12 months is sufficient to meet ECHR obligations, but I'm grateful to the Government for accepting my amendment for a review to leave open the door for further change if necessary. In any case, Scotland should not be making a habit of settling for the bare minimum on human rights, as we did on the age of criminal responsibility last year, despite my party's best efforts. Human rights are not a pick-and-mix principle. They apply to everyone. Remember, prisoners' voting rights are unrestricted in many developed nations across the world, in Austria, in Canada, in Denmark, in Norway, the Netherlands, and Sweden, to name but a few. And despite some of the rhetoric we've heard this afternoon from the benches to my left, they make us believe these democracies have not collapsed in on themselves. Instead of stubbornly trailing behind international best practice, Scotland should be pushing it. While this bill does not put us at the forefront, I remain hopeful of more progress in future, building on the welcome steps that we are taking today. And on that basis, Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the bill at decision time this afternoon. Thank you.
Before we move on to the open debate, I'd like to advise members that we are still running behind time. I would therefore invite the Cabinet Secretary to move a motion under Rule 8.14.3 that this afternoon's session be extended to up to 5:15 p.m.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Is the Chamber content to extend this session under Rule 8.14.3 to up to 5:15 p.m? That is agreed. Thank you very much. We'll move to the open debate. Speeches of up to 4 minutes, please. Bill Kidd, followed by Liam Kerr.
And thank you, Presiding Officer. Over the course of this parliamentary term, members of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, of which I am the convener, have delved into poignant questions posed by the Scottish Elections, Franchise and Representation Bill. As the name suggests, these questions revolve around core elements of democracy: the role of the social contract, obligations of the state, protection of voting rights and extension of the franchise. These are all complex points of discussion. I want to take this opportunity to thank my fellow committee members and the clerks team for their dedicated and sincere engagement with these points of discussion over the past months. A good deal of work has gone into the creation of this bill, and I am pleased with the outcome so far, and we have collectively pushed on to find the most appropriate, legally compliant and just way forward. May I please state at this point that in saying this, it should be noted that not all committee members agreed on every element, but any disagreement was carried out in a dignified and civilised manner, and we'd all like to thank everyone for that. I echo the sentiment of the Cabinet Secretary in hoping that two-thirds majority at the very least accept this bill. The need to bridge a legal contradiction that has arisen between the Scotland Act and the blanket ban on all prisoners from voting necessitates the creation of this bill. The blanket ban only has a short historical precedence. In fact, it was in the 1960s, relatively recently, that many prisoners in the UK were enfranchised. Now, however, our current law is at odds with the conclusions of many legislators in other healthy democracies and is in conflict with the ECHR and the Scotland Act. And following Scottish Government consultation and committee engagement, this bill amends current legislation to extend the franchise to prisoners with a sentence of less than a year. This conclusion has been reached on the basis that there should be a relationship between the seriousness of a crime and that ability to vote. What is notable about this cut-off point is that 12 months is the maximum sentence that can be imposed in a summary trial, and this type of trial does not involve a jury and considers crimes only of a less serious nature. The member balance the committee has found of a 12-month cut-off, and it is a member balance because, as I say, not everyone agrees on everything, reflects the outcome of the Scottish Government consultation. This balance also provides the Scottish Parliament with a way forward that is compliant with our specific ECHR duties under the Scotland Act. In addition, this way forward maintains the extremely important link between the right to vote and the fulfilment of the social contract. Aside from these elements, the bill brings about other changes that will make the extension of the franchise reflect Scottish society in the more globalised 21st century. An elevating element of this bill is to allow qualifying foreign nationals to vote. This legislative change means the evolution of migration and its impact on the makeup of Scottish society is recognised. The change also importantly ensures that EU nationals living in Scotland with settled status will still be able to vote in post-Brexit elections, and the legislation also empowers refugees with the leave to remain to have the franchise extend to them also. Anyone with the right to remain will have the right to vote in Scotland, and that is an incredible step forward from the present circumstance. Voting for legislation that takes crucial steps towards empowering vulnerable or socially disenfranchised groups is a powerful moment for legislators. Today we have the opportunity to vote for a bill that will make our voting landscape brighter and more reflective of the inspiring and evolving society that defines Scotland, and I hope everyone will join me today in making this a reality. Thank you very much.
Liam Kerr, followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I shall not vote for this bill this evening due to its proposing to give the vote to prisoners serving sentences in prison. I address my comments not so much to the likes of Alex Cole-Hamilton, who has been consistent that the vote should be given to prisoners simply because, and I am paraphrasing here, prisoners should have their voice heard and influence how the country is run. I fundamentally disagree with that premise because I cannot accept that those who commit crimes of such severity that, despite the presumption against short sentences, the desire to give community disposals and the increase in electronic monitoring, they still go to prison, should be granted the vote over the rights of victims that they offended against. But I accept it is a position which will not be swayed by recourse to the cold reality of legal argument. Furthermore, I shall not expend time addressing those whose position crumbles in the face of facts, yet will not change their vote regardless. I have in my mind those such as Gil Patterson, who said at stage 1 and rehearsed today in amendments, in my opinion, those who have been convicted of more serious crimes, particularly those of a sexual nature, violent crimes and crimes that harm people, have forfeited their right to vote, which accords with the government's position. Voting rights should be extended only to less serious offences. That's spot on. And in 2018, Mr Patterson, nearly 9,500 people received a custodial sentence of 12 months or less. Of those, over 100 were convicted of attempted murder or serious assault. 98 were sexual offenders, and 329 were for handling offensive weapons. Mr Patterson is right. They should forfeit their right to vote. But he nevertheless voted at stage 1 to give it, and in doing so made clear that logical argument will not change his position. No, Presiding Officer, I address my comments to those who seek the sanctuary of the European Convention of Human Rights and say, look, I don't like it, but we must go to 12 months to be compliant. That argument, Presiding Officer, is fundamentally flawed, because nowhere does the Convention accord an individual right for prisoners to vote. Indeed, nowhere does it confer such a right on anybody, let alone prisoners. Now, that makes sense, because when someone is punished by imprisonment for committing a crime, they have certain rights curtailed, such as the rights to freedom, such as the right to privacy, but also the right to vote. And for 23 years, until the Hearst case in 2005 discovered it, there was no such right. Now, leaving aside the difficulties in that case highlighted by Adam Tomkins at stage 1, crucially, there was no respect in that judgment for the margin of appreciation on which the convention system depends. And that margin is part of our law. The Law Society made clear at an earlier stage the franchise of prisoners may be restricted, provided that the restriction is proportionate to achieving a legitimate aim. Indeed, the Cabinet Secretary is authority for this, stating, members who are familiar with the Hearst ruling know the court allows member states a wide margin of appreciation. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to ensuring compliance. He's absolutely correct. And that is why the United Kingdom's solution to the Hearst case, to give the right to vote to prisoners who are released on temporary licence or on remand, has been accepted as a solution by the Committee of Ministers, which is the enforcement agency of the Council of Europe. The inescapable conclusion is that this Parliament is not mandated to enfranchise this category of prisoners at all, and is going further than is either necessary or desirable to meet the Hearst requirements. And therefore, those who claim to be voting for this legislation for reasons of an obligation to comply with the law are misguided and making not a legal, but a purely political decision. Presiding Officer, let there be no doubt that any member who votes for this bill at decision time tonight is voting to prioritise giving prisoners the vote over the human rights to life, to freedom from torture, to freedom of family life of victims and families. And they are doing so not because they are required to by any law or legal principle, but because that is where their priorities lie. Let them live with the consequences and their consciences. Thank you.
Alec Rowley, followed by Gil Patterson.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to speak in the Stage 3 debate today on the Scottish Election Franchise and Representation Bill. In the Stage 1 debate for this bill, I commended the committee for its report on the bill, and I would like to reiterate that, as well as commend the work of the committee taking the bill through to Stage 3. I welcome the direction that has been taken by this bill, and I do believe it will strengthen and improve the administration of devolved elections here in Scotland. Increasing participation in elections by encouraging people to vote and stand for election should be a key priority for any well-functioning democracy, and I am glad that this bill will help in this regard. It is welcome to see Scotland take measures that will give the right to vote to more people who live, work and make their homes here. During the last debate, Professor Tomkins raised concerns he had regarding the concept of citizenship, but I would like to draw his attention to a briefing that came through this morning for this debate from the Scottish Refugee Council. They state, as it stands, the vast majority of refugees cannot vote in any election in the UK until they have acquired British citizenship. Refugees from former Commonwealth countries are the only exception, as they are considered qualifying foreign nationals for the purpose of elections. We believe that the requirement to obtain citizenship in order to vote creates an unreasonable high barrier to political participation for refugees. Not only is the citizenship process expensive and complex, and it can also be applied for only after a minimum of 6 years residency within the UK. Many refugees living in Scotland do not have British citizenship and live here either with leave to remain as a refugee, which is for 5 years, or indefinite leave to remain. Therefore, I welcome the fact that this bill is set to change all that by enfranchising everyone who is lawfully resident in Scotland, regardless of nationality. As I said before, foreign nationals who make their homes in Scotland contribute greatly to our society, and it is only right that those who are legally resident in Scotland and contributing to our society in Scotland should have a say on the decisions that affect their daily lives. I am pleased to be supporting this bill today, and I hope that it does send a message that Scotland is a welcoming, inclusive country where everyone is treated equally, no matter where they are from. I hope that the bill has a positive impact on showing to those that are lawfully resident in Scotland that they have a voice, and that this country is their home. I also hope that it helps with further integration within our communities and helps to deliver the inclusive Scotland that I believe we all in this chamber want to achieve. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, making use of powers over elections and the franchise provisions devolved to the Scottish Parliament by the Scotland 2016 Act is essential to the creation of a fairer and more inclusive Scotland. And the proposals in the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representations Bill will, in my opinion, enhance democracy in Scotland and will enhance Scotland's standing in the world's democratic nations. Decisions already taken by the Parliament to lower the voting age to 16 has already had significant positive impact on political activity, bringing appreciation and involvement in the political process to Scotland's younger voters, which is in stark contrast to experiences elsewhere in these islands. There is no doubt that issues such as climate change and Brexit will have much more severe long-term implications for the younger generations, and a strong voice should be heard. In Scotland, because of the franchise changes made, this can be done through the ballot box. It has always shocked me that the so-called universal franchise in the UK is so restrictive. For example, EU citizens who make their homes, raise their families and contribute to the economic and social well-being of this country were denied the right to vote in a referendum which will remove the UK from the European Union. I think for someone who has a legal right to residency in Britain should also have the right to vote, and I am pleased that this legislation will at least provide foreign nationals with that right and the right to stand for election in the Scottish parliamentary and local government elections. It is very telling that 92% of organisations and 78% of individuals who responded to the Scottish Government's consultation also support this reform, which says to me that we are on the correct direction in creating a better and more inclusive society. Although my heart says we should incorporate asylum seekers, these new provisions, I have to agree with the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, MSP, who articulated the problem on the 10th of October in the evidence session to the committee and backed up today very well in his presentation to us earlier on, which essentially said that under the UK jurisdiction, it will be extremely difficult to grant the right to vote to people who have no right to be in the UK in the first place. However, if migration was devolved to the Scottish Government, or when Scotland becomes an independent nation, then I am perfectly sure that things would indeed change for the better. With regard to voting rights for prisoners, the proposals are just about correct with those serving sentences of 12 months. And it's the 12 months one that I'm really interested in, because for too long, women, particularly women who have maybe been repeat offenders, who may be committing low-level crimes repeatedly to help their families, should not, in my view, be incarcerated. I find that barbaric. So the fact that they will be entitled to vote is some small measure to go along to the way that I feel about how women in poor circumstances, normally brought about by society and the pressures that we put on them by cutting, for instance, the support financially that they should be entitled to. Apart from now complying with the European Convention on Human Rights, these provisions both fulfil our desire for rehabilitation of prisoners, particularly those on short sentences and less serious crimes, and also excludes those convicted of serious crimes who are a danger to the progression of a better and safer society. And the majority of Scotland wants this to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. And we move to the closing speeches. James Kelly, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In closing, obviously a lot of the debate has focused around the issue of prisoner voting. I mean, I would make the point that it's perhaps a test of the progress that the Parliament's made, that in 2020 we've arrived at a position where we're prepared to support prisoner voting, or a partial extension of prisoner voting. I explained in my opening speech the position I took in 2013, and I explained the reasons why I opposed it then, but I support the position now. And there are a lot of MSPs in the Chamber that will vote tonight who took part in that vote in 2013. And I think that shows a democratic institution where people are prepared to accept not just their legal responsibilities, but look at the issues and arrive at a position. I mean, I think the situation that Mr Halker-Johnson outlined from, the Kenny McCaskill article, where there was a lot of nervousness behind closed doors, that's possibly accurate. But the reality is it's where we are now. And, Mr Kerr outlined a position where he felt that many people were just hiding behind the European Court judgment and said we need to do something to comply with that. I have to say, in looking at the different debates that have taken place on this, not just in the Chamber but in committee, and to speaking to MSPs about the Parliament, that's not my experience. I think a lot of people. This is a difficult issue for MSPs in all parties. People will have debated this in their groups, but I think ultimately the consensus that the Parliament will arrive at will not only be the right one, it will be the one that MSPs are comfortable with. And I think from that point of view, it's actually helpful that a super majority is required tonight, because this is a big change. It's a change from the position we took previously. And it will require the support of 86 MSPs at, I was going to say 5 o'clock, at 10 past 5, in order for this to become law. And I think that shows that the arrangements around this are robust. I accept the point that Mr Russell made earlier in terms of balance. I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he said based on the current prison population, it would cover 695 prisoners out of a population of just over 6,000. I think that's right, and I think that's proportionate. I also think the Liam MacArthur amendments that were passed earlier give the ability to review the arrangements once the Scottish Parliament and local elections have taken place. I also think that there also have been some good contributions around the issue of non-Scottish citizens who are legally resident here, also been part of that franchise. I think Alec Rowley made a very good speech in that regard, and I think it's right, again, if we're a modern country, if we're asking people to live and work here and contribute to their community and their economy, then it's only right that they have a vote. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour will support the bill at decision time. I believe that these are important changes, and it sends a powerful message from the Scottish Parliament that we're going to extend the franchise in this regard.
Yeah. Adam Tomkins, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary, Mr Russell, earlier on this afternoon described this legislation as a significant, indeed massive step forward, and later on this afternoon described it as a historic change, and I think it is. And I think that it's a historic change that goes to the heart of something that Bill Kidd said in his opening remarks earlier this afternoon when he talked about the role of the social contract. And that's what I want to talk about in my closing remarks. Scottish Conservatives will oppose this bill tonight, and will oppose both parts of this bill, and will oppose both parts of this bill for the same fundamental reason. We don't think that the franchise should be extended to foreign nationals on the basis of residency, and we don't think that the franchise should be extended to prisoners who are serving terms of imprisonment in Scotland. And the reason why we think that it ultimately boils down to the same. And that is that we think that voting and the franchise are intimately connected with or associated with citizenship. Now, there is an alternative view, and it has been very eloquently put this afternoon by Mark Ruskell and by Liam MacArthur in particular. And they take the view that there is no relationship anymore in the modern world between citizenship and voting, and that the historic link that they surely acknowledge as a matter of history between the franchise and citizenship has now been broken, and that the right to vote is just like any other human right, in that it is universal, it is basic and universal, and it is shared equally by us all. Well, that is not the view that we take in the Conservative Party to voting, and it's also not the view that is taken in the European Convention on Human Rights to voting, because as Liam Kerr correctly said, there is no right to vote in the European Convention on Human Rights, because those who wrote the European Convention on Human Rights understood that the right to vote, important as it is, fundamental as it is to our social contract, is not a human right, because we don't share it universally. It is a right which is associated with citizenship. Now, the United Kingdom is not and never has been a country that insists that you must be a citizen, a British citizen, before you can vote here. We extend the franchise, of course, to Irish citizens. We extend the franchise, of course, to citizens of Commonwealth countries who are lawfully resident in the United Kingdom, because they have citizenship which is intimately associated with the United Kingdom. But this bill goes so much further than that in breaking the link altogether. It does. It breaks the link altogether between citizenship and the franchise. And the question I have asked repeatedly throughout this process is, well, if that's what we want to do, fine. And I completely respect the position of Mr. Ruskell and the position of Mr. MacArthur, that old historic link between citizenship and the franchise is no longer material, and we just want to do as if it's a universal human right. Fine, that's a perfectly respectable position, but it poses this question, and I think the passage of this bill poses a really interesting and profound question for this Parliament to address in the near future. What do we think citizenship does then? What is the value that citizenship adds to residency if it isn't partly encapsulated by the right to participate in and vote in elections and referendums in this country? Now, I don't think that citizenship is all about voting. I think there's much more to citizenship than that, but I do not want to break that link between citizenship and the franchise, and that's the reason of principle. There's a philosophical reason why we will oppose this bill tonight. I fully understand that that is not the only principled position that one can take with regard to modern electoral law, but that is our position and has been throughout this bill's legislative process. I want to say a few things more about prisoners' right to vote and the Hurst judgment, which Liam Kerr so expertly demolished in his remarks. I've already said that in the European Convention on Human Rights, there is no right to vote. So the Hurst judgment rests on a double legal error. First, it pretends that there is a right to vote in the European Convention. And secondly, it says that the current UK legal position, or the then current UK legal position, was a blanket ban on prisoner enfranchisement. And a number of members have used that expression this afternoon, and they are, as the European Court of Human Rights was, with respect, wrong to do so. There is no and never has been a blanket ban on prisoners voting in the United Kingdom. Prisoners on remand can vote. Prisoners who are incarcerated because they are in contempt of court can vote and have never been disenfranchised. That's not a blanket ban. It is a general exception to which there are a general prohibition on banning to which there are specific exemptions. And the European Court of Human Rights should never have gone anywhere near this because it isn't in the Convention. The European Court of Human Rights should never have gone anywhere near this because there is no pan-European consensus on the matter. The European Court of Human Rights should never have gone anywhere near this because they should have owed to the United Kingdom the margin of appreciation which we are due as a member state of the Council of Ministers. I don't have time, I'm in my last few seconds, I'm sorry. And the European Court of Human Rights should never have gone anywhere near this for all of these reasons. But the solution to it does not rest in enfranchising all prisoners in Scotland who are sentenced to terms of imprisonment of up to a year. Minimal compliance, which is what the United Kingdom is avowedly doing with this rotten judgment, doubly rotten judgment, is still compliance. And Mr Russell says, well, yes, it's all very well for the Committee of Ministers to sign it off, but it could still be challenged in court. So the question I have for the Cabinet Secretary, if he's still with us, the question I have for the Cabinet Secretary is, can he tell me a case where the Committee of Ministers have accepted the position of a Member State where that issue has nonetheless been challenged successfully in court? There is no realistic prospect of the UK's position being successfully challenged in court, given the view of the Committee of Ministers. And those are the reasons of principle, Presiding Officer, on which the Conservatives rest this evening.
I now call on Michael Russell to wind up the debate for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I follow on from what we've just heard from Mr Tomkins in a positive sense? Because I think there are genuinely different views being held here. And there are genuine different views also of what the position is under ECHR. Because ECHR has consistently, since Hearst, the court has, since Hearst, reiterated the right to fair and free elections includes the right to vote. There's a margin of appreciation, but that's not unlimited. A blanket ban is outside that margin. And that is where we are today. Now, there's a difference of opinion. There will always be difference of opinion. I think that we should respect each other in those circumstances. And the only departure from that today, regrettably, came from Liam Kerr, who started out accepting the different views, and then I have to say, then just went into in the last few months, a Tory law and order rant. And I want to draw him back from that to a piece of evidence from Her Majesty Inspector to Prisons for Scotland in September 2019. Evidence to the SPPA committee from a body that I don't think is partisan in this. And it said this. This is about people in prison. They are from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons for Scotland. Their path into crime often starts with vulnerabilities not properly identified or responded to at the appropriate time, or a lack of opportunities, sometimes linked to deprivation and other barriers that are not easily overcome. Exclusion from the electoral process may potentially only add to their sense of alienation and marginalisation in a way that may not help with efforts to encourage rehabilitation and reduce the risk of reoffending. That would not be in the best interest of society, even though that may not necessarily be fully recognised by the public. That, in my view, is a very significant contribution to this debate. Because we must recognise that our job is to take a judgment, a proportional judgment, between that position which we respect and the positions of others who are totally opposed to this. For example, victims of crime. And not all victims of crime are opposed to this, but there are those who are opposed to it. So we're trying to take that proportional position. And we're doing it within the concept of franchise reform. And no franchise is static. All electoral franchises are dynamic. And there will be common ground on this. The Abbé Say, essentially the intellectual father of the French Revolution, believed in direct, positive, participatory democracy. A man who asked a question, in a sense that I'm not trying to equate the Abbé Say with Mr. Tomkins, but who asked the question, what is the nation? And asking what is a citizen is an entirely legitimate thing to do. But of course, the process of changing that franchise is not instantaneous. No franchise is fully formed or ever fully formed, and it continues to change and to develop. For example, what we decide here today will change in time, and there will be different approaches to it. And that's one of the reasons I backed Mr. MacArthur's recommendation, because it is right that we look at this in a period of time and say, are there changes we still need to have here? These won't be considered in that review, but for example, the equation between the right to vote and the right to stand is a legitimate issue and needs to be considered. We have not consulted on the right to stand for 16 and 17-year-olds, but at some stage that will have to be considered. Things keep evolving. But if I could say, not unkindly, but one of the common parts in this debate is the view of Conservatives that things should not change fast at all. The name Conservative gives it away. Things should not change. And it is radical voices that can move it forward, and that's why I respect where Mr. Ruskell has been. It is radical voices that can help to move it forward. But there's a job in the middle, and the job in the middle is not to hold things back, but to make sure they can be put in place in a way that is efficient and effective and achievable. And there is no point in doing things that are not achievable. And that's what we've been trying to do. So when Mr. Rachael urges me to get to the limits of devolution, I want to go well beyond the limits of devolution. But I want to do it in a way that is sustainable, and which we can say to the people of Scotland, we have done that, and that is now what is going to happen. We can't do that and say to people, well, we've done that, and on a wing and a prayer, we hope that it might work. And that's responding to advice, and that's our job, to respond to that advice and to move forward. But also we need to recognise, and it's something that I'm sure Mr. Rachael will accept, you cannot do everything under devolution. That is why I believe in independence. You have to do things fully and completely. And you can't design an electoral system that takes in issues, that takes in substantial issues of migration, without saying we need to change the system of migration. Because we need to recognise in that system that there are things that we can't do that we should be able to do. I want to be bold to do it. I don't want to be timid or timorous, and I'm not timid or timorous. But boldness isn't just about words. Boldness is about achieving. It's about actions that stick. It is moving things forward in a constructive way that will stick. And that indeed, Presiding Officer, is what we have been trying to do. I just want to finish, Presiding Officer, on another quotation. I started with one from the evidence to the SPPA. And I have to say that Mr. Rowley quoted the evidence from the Scottish Refugee Council. And we need to keep in our mind that this is a radical and progressive bill. And sometimes in this chamber, the forces of progress are divided by questions including the constitutional question. But it is possible for the forces of progress to come together and to say there are good things. We have some common view of what Scotland should look like that is not only defined by the Constitution. Can we put elements of that into place now, even with the limits of devolution? And this is one of those moments where there is the possibility to look at the type of Scotland we would all like to achieve, the things that are going to be important in our vision of Scotland, and to put them into place. And it was the Scottish Refugee Council that talked about this bill in those terms in its evidence, in the Stage 2 briefing note that Mr. Rowley referred to. And I want to quote from that. The Scottish Refugee Council said, "We maintain that the bill is a truly exciting piece of legislation, set to address a long-standing democratic deficit, whereby thousands of new Scots have been unable to participate formally in Scottish democracy. By granting voting rights to all those who are lawfully resident in Scotland without a residency requirement, this legislation reflects Scotland's reputation for being a welcoming, inclusive country where everyone is treated equally no matter where they are from." The passing of this legislation, that is the challenge that we now face in this chamber, because this legislation, for the first time ever under devolution, requires a supermajority. So we have to have 86 progressive voices in this chamber, 86 or more progressive choices. I've never actually seen Mr. Rumbles as one of those progressive voices, but I am sometimes I am wrong. I have to say, I know that is a surprise. I know Mr. MacArthur looks shocked by that idea. Mr. Simpson looks shocked too. Sometimes I am wrong, and if those progressive voices are to be heard, I look forward to hearing them from all of the Liberal Democrats tonight as forces for progress. But we need, Presiding Officer, 86 or more progressive voices in this chamber who are going to say that is the type of Scotland that we want to deliver. No matter our views on other matters, let us deliver it. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I go back to where I started. There are different views of how democracy changes. There are different views of the society in which we wish to live. Some contend, as the Conservatives do, that we already live in perfection. Some of us believe that we live in imperfection, and we need to continue to change and to develop the society in which we live. But we all in this chamber get the chance, from time to time, to show what we believe, to show whether we believe in that progressive society or not, to show where our philosophical view is of what society is. And Mr. Tomkins has laid out eloquently and well some of the elements of his own vision. But tonight we have the chance to move in that way. And I would ask all members of this chamber to consider very carefully before they cast their vote, given the requirement for 2/3 of members to show their progressive instincts, to consider very carefully both the issue of prisoner voting and to consider the issue of the wider franchise, to ask themselves what that says about their view of Scotland, to follow their consciences in that matter, and I hope to support this bill at decision time, as I shall be doing.
Thank you very much, Mr Russell. And that concludes our Stage 3 debate on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. Before we come to decision time, the next item is actually consideration of legislative consent motion S5M 20921 on terrorist offenders restriction of early release bill. Could I ask Hamza Youssef first of all to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now I call on John Finney.
Presiding Officer, the Justice Committee were invited to consider the legislative consent motion earlier in the week, and if passed, it alters Scottish Ministers' executive competencies. It disapplies existing Scottish Ministers' powers of early release of relevant prisoners, and it alters Scottish Ministers' executive competence by making transitional provisions relating to the operation of supervised release orders. Now, committees play a vital role in scrutinising legislation in this Parliament. This proposal was on 3 sides of A4. Within that, we were told the bill is currently subject to an expedited timetable. And I think it's entirely fair to record the Scottish Government indicated reservations about the pace of this proposal. Just over a week between announcement and introduction. There was no consultation by the UK Government to the bill. There's no financial impact assessment. There's no equalities impact assessment. There's no human rights impact assessment. There's no community impact assessment. Now, public safety is paramount. And whilst it's not we should never be complacent, I think there's satisfaction in the systems that exist in Scotland for dealing with such offenders, 5 in number, we were told by the Cabinet Secretary. So what is the problem the UK Government is seeking to address? Is it about sentencing policy in England and Wales, prisoner rehabilitation in England and Wales, risk assessment associated with prisoner release in England and Wales, the role of the parole board in England and Wales? If that's the case, then they should review and change these processes. We legislate in haste and repent at leisure. Now, I absolutely accept that terrorism is a reserved to the UK Government. Thus far, at least, sentencing and penal policy have not been. And I believe this legislative consent motion creates a dangerous precedent, both in terms of speed of the proposed change and the overt intrusion into our legal system. We need to make evidence decisions, and we normally spend several months in this place doing that, not 20-odd minutes considering proposals. We didn't hear from practitioners. We didn't hear any regard to the different profile of prisoners in Scotland as compared to elsewhere. And as I say, I certainly gained the impression the Scottish Government were not actively promoting this LCM. The Scottish Government assert, and I quote here, that law will not be workable if relevant changes that affect executive competence of the Scottish Ministers are not made. Well, of course, we have existing differences at the moment between the legal systems in the application of sentencing and release, and I would ask, has there been a problem with that? If approved, this change will mean different treatment within our legal system, and that may yet be a problem. We make laws because there's an evidence base. No such evidence has been forthcoming. The whole approach devalues our Parliament and our legal system and should be voted down. Finally, Presiding Officer, members may be interested to know that Jonathan Hall QC, who was appointed in May 2019 by the Home Secretary as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, has said these proposals could backfire, are counterproductive, and that the Lords should consider striking them down. I would encourage members to heed Mr Hall's wise counsel and oppose the legislative consent motion. Thank you.
Can I thank you, Mr Finney? Can I call on the Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef to respond for the Government?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can understand why John Finney has decided to oppose this legislative consent motion. When I debated the LCM with Mr Finney at the Justice Committee earlier this week, I made clear that I had deep reservations about the speed with which the UK Government bill is being rushed through Westminster. I also made clear I had deep reservations about the policy intent of the UK Government of simply locking up terrorist offenders for longer without clear accompanying steps to effectively de-radicalise terrorist offenders. On that latter point, I was very clear that there is evidence, quite substantial evidence, that suggests one of the most challenging places to de-radicalise individuals is in a custodial environment. So I'm under no illusion that the UK Government may well be guilty with this legislation of simply kicking the can down the road. It's not just me who thinks that. It is also, for example, David Merritt, the father of Jack Merritt, who tragically lost his life in the London Bridge attack late last year. I think it's worth reflecting exactly on what David Merritt has said. He said, and I quote, Longer sentences by themselves just equal kicking the can down the road, allowing prisoners to de-radicalise each other, prisoners to radicalise each other and build greater resentment. The key has to be de-radicalisation, rehabilitation, supervision and diverting people from this path in the first place. And now we also have the independent reviewer, as John Finney has said, also expressing some concerns. Within that context, the Scottish Government was faced with a decision when the UK Government decided that their terrorist offender bill would extend to Scotland. In order for the UK bill to work without error or confusion, some change in law to the functions of Scottish ministers are required, and these changes trigger the need for an LCM. Without these changes being made, the law in the area of enforcement of terrorist sentencing would be unclear at best, possibly defective and inoperable at worst. Let me give the Chamber a specific example, which I also gave to committee. Currently, a long-term prisoner can be considered for parole at the halfway point of their sentence. Release will take place by the Scottish ministers if the Independent Parole Board recommends it. This bill requires a change to these Scottish ministerial functions to change the application of this function to the two-thirds point of the sentence onwards. That is why the LCM is necessary, as it changes the executive competence of Scottish ministers. If the LCM is not agreed and the UK Government remove the relevant provisions from the bill, that would lead to confusion in terms of a long-term terrorist offender, when they should be released. Should they be released at the halfway point or the two-thirds point? And it runs the risk of errors arising as to how this area of law actually operates. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the policy intent of this UK Government bill, I don't think any member can think that this error or confusion should be allowed to happen in law. It's also the case, Presiding Officer, that the Scottish Government, of course, cannot legislate for terror offences. That is, as John Finney has mentioned, a reserved matter. So in order for the UK Government bill policy intent of changing the point at which parole board discretionary release can operate from the halfway point of sentence to the two-third point of sentence, this requires, as I say, a change in functions of Scottish ministers. The change in function will permit Scottish ministers to release relevant offenders when recommended to do so by the parole board. As already explained, for long-term prisoners serving terrorism sentences, this will be from the two-thirds point of sentence rather than the existing halfway point of the sentence. And there are other similar changes in functions of Scottish ministers which are specified within the legislative consent memorandum. So it is on balance and with careful consideration, with the reservations about the policy intent that I have expressed, that I'm asking for members to support the LCM in my name, as not to do so could bring with it error and confusion in the law of sentencing. I'm pleased that the Justice Committee report has recommended Parliament approve this LCM, and while I respect the position of John Finney, I always do in terms of human rights issues, in opposing this LCM, I ask members to approve the legislative consent motion at decision time for the reasons given, and I move the LCM in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Youssef. And the decision on this motion will come at decision time, which we'll reach in a second. The next item is consideration of business motion S5M 20956 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a revision to business on Thursday the 27th of February. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No one has asked to speak on this motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20956 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So returning to decision time now. Our first question is that motion 20922 in the name of Michael Russell on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill at stage 3 be agreed. And I would remind members that this bill, for the first time ever, requires a supermajority to be passed. That means that 86 members are required to vote for the bill to be passed. And members should cast those votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20922 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 92, no 27. There were no abstentions. The motion is agreed. That means a supermajority has been achieved and the Scottish Elections, Franchise and Representation Bill is passed. And our final question is that motion 20921 in the name of Hamza Youssef on an LCM terrorist offenders restriction of early release bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on this motion. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on motion 20921 in the name of Hamza Youssef is yes 105, no 11. There were 3 abstentions and the motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes our business. That concludes decision time. I close this meeting.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.